Hey, guys. Dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the medieval world, looking pale wasn't a sign that you needed more sleep. It was a fashion statement, a social flex, a silent announcement to the world that said I am too rich to ever see the sun. Thank you very much, unlike today, where a healthy glow might suggest yoga, smoothies, or a trip to the coast. Medieval beauty flipped the script. Tan skin. That meant you worked outside, which meant you were poor, which meant manual labor. And nothing said not beautiful in the 14th century, like knowing how to milk a cow. So the paler you were, the higher your perceived status. And when we say pale, we don't mean a soft ivory glow. We're talking translucent porcelain with vascular undertones. Skin so light it looked like you might have been recently startled by a ghost or were a ghost. Of course, nature doesn't always cooperate, especially if you were born with an actual working circulatory system. So people helped it along. Noble women, and even men occasionally, would apply white lead powder to their faces. It provided that signature corpse chic glow, and as a bonus, slowly poisoned you, but beauty has always had its price. Some would use vinegar-soaked cloths to bleach their skin. Others applied a mixture of crushed pearls and egg whites, which not only lightened the face, but also had the side effect of making one's cheeks feel like a stale omelet. Veins were sometimes painted onto the arms and chest, using blue pigment to simulate delicacy, because nothing says noble like pretending your skin is about to split open. Even literature got in on it. Romantic poems described women as pale as milk, white as snow, and once as the moon in winter, which is a nice way of saying she looks like she might faint. I love it. This pale aesthetic wasn't just about beauty. It was shorthand for class, purity, and complete economic disengagement with agriculture. If you could afford to be fragile, you were winning. Beauty in the Middle Ages often required commitment. And by commitment, we mean a slow, decorative form of chemical warfare on yourself. Because for those striving to achieve that prestigious pale complexion, nature just wasn't enough. So they reached for makeup, specifically lead-based white face powder. Yes, lead as in the thing we now seal off old buildings for, but back then, it was considered cutting edge. The result was a smooth, pale matte finish, the medieval equivalent of high-definition foundation. It made the skin look flawless, and eventually feel very not flawless. White lead powder was made by combining vinegar and metal, then allowing it to corrode into a white crust that could be ground into a fine powder. Apply that daily and voila, you look like a luminous, delicate aristocrat with a secret death wish. And if your skin began to flake, blister, or fall off in small diplomatic chunks, even better, it meant the makeup was working. Probably this wasn't a one-product routine either. Many added mercury-based rouge for color or chalk dust for more staying power. Egg whites were brushed over the face for a smooth, glazed look. Basically, if it came from a barn or an alchemist's shelf, someone had rubbed it on their face in the name of elegance. The downside? Other than the obvious slow poisoning, lead-based products caused everything from chronic fatigue and skin ulcers to hair loss and premature death, which is not listed on most modern skincare labels. But the fashion endured. Because if the choice was between dying slowly and being mistaken for a peasant, nobility often chose the scenic route to the grave. Men weren't always immune either. Some male courtiers also used powders or skin treatments, especially in the later medieval and early Renaissance courts, where image mattered almost as much as lineage, or at least as much as smelling less terrible than your rival. Of all the medieval beauty trends, the obsession with high foreheads may be the most eyebrow-raising. Literally, because people were removing their eyebrows for it. A tall, smooth, uninterrupted forehead wasn't just fashionable. It was considered elegant, intelligent, and divine. It was the architectural marvel of the medieval face. The ideal forehead said, I spend my days reading psalms and looking pensively out of castle windows, not I own a shovel. To achieve this noble look, women went to extreme and frankly itchy measures. Eyebrows were plucked out completely, and sometimes even scalp hair was removed inch by inch to push the hairline further back. This wasn't a trim. This was a full-on forehead expansion project. Medieval grooming manuals advised women to use tweezers, hot cloths, and depilatory creams made from things like cat dung, quicklime, or vinegar-soaked leeches, all in the name of showcasing a forehead that could double as a sundial. The results were striking. Portraits from the time show women with serene expressions and foreheads so vast you could host a joust on them. Combined with pale skin and soft facial features, this high-domed aesthetic became shorthand for refined beauty. It wasn't all about the face either. Fashion supported this look. Tight-fitting hoods, wimples, and hennets. Those famous cone-shaped hats all helped pull the hairline up, or at least hide the part where your eyebrows used to live. And this wasn't just some isolated castle trend. From England to France to Italy, noble women leaned into the high forehead style, while artists and poets reinforced it by praising women whose faces began somewhere near the crown of the head. Of course, not everyone could afford the time or tools to pluck themselves into perfection. So in a moment of medieval ingenuity, some women faked it by drawing their new forehead slightly higher, and covering the rest with headbands or veils. That's right, the Middle Ages had their own version of contouring. It just involved a lot more fabric. In medieval Europe, eyebrows weren't just underappreciated, they were actively eliminated. Modern trends may celebrate bold brows, feathered arches, and TikTok tutorials, but in the 14th and 15th centuries, eyebrows were seen as unnecessary facial clutter. To achieve the ideal look, women plucked their eyebrows into near non-existence or erased them entirely. Why? Because a bare, smooth forehead was considered elegant and refined, and any sign of actual hair growth interrupted the aesthetic. Eyebrows were basically seen as stubborn weeds on the garden of the face. Some went even further and shaved the brow area completely, ensuring that not a single strand interfered with their alabaster. High dome glory. It's the sort of commitment that would make modern beauty influences blink twice, mostly because there were no brow pencils to draw them back in. To remove the brows, medieval women used tweezers, wax, pumice stones, or for the especially brave, mixtures containing quicklime, vinegar, or arsenic. Yes, arsenic, because nothing says dedication to your look like risking mild facial melting. This was more than just a passing fad. Art from the period, from illuminated manuscripts to oil portraits, confirms the trend. Noble women are frequently depicted with smooth foreheads and expressionless eyes, framed by nothing but skin. The result is either serene or slightly alien. Depends on the lighting. Interestingly, the no-brow trend wasn't entirely uniform. In some parts of Europe, thin or lightly arched brows persisted, especially as influences from the Middle East and Byzantine Empire filtered through trade and war. But by and large, the message was clear. If people can see your eyebrows, you're doing it wrong. And this wasn't just for women. Men, especially those close to court life, occasionally trimmed or groomed their brows as part of a larger aesthetic of refinement, though full removal was rare among males unless they'd lost them in a particularly heated theological debate. What this all tells us is that medieval beauty ideals weren't about looking natural. They were about looking curated, symbolic, and just a bit angelic. Angels, after all, rarely have brows in art. Coincidence? Possibly. But it worked for them. In the Middle Ages, having a touch of color in your cheeks was desirable. But like most things in medieval life, there were rules, social risks, and a vague chance of damnation. The ideal was a subtle blush, like you just heard a mildly scandalous poem or stepped outdoors for 30 seconds, but not long enough to tan. Heaven forbid, a gentle rose hue on the cheeks suggested youth, fertility, and general survival, all things that were considered attractive, particularly if you could maintain them past the age of 28. But you couldn't look like you were trying. Applying rouge was considered vain, and vanity was suspiciously close to sin. The church was not amused by women smearing color on their faces, unless, of course, they were nobility or doing it humbly, which is a theological gray area scholars are still trying to define. Still, women improvised. Common blush ingredients included beetroot juice, crushed strawberries, mulberries, or even cochineal, a deep red pigment made from crushed insects. Yes, bugs. Because beauty has never been kind. Some rubbed their cheeks to get that natural flush, while others used mixtures of red ochre or wine sediment, dabbed carefully to avoid detection by both clergy and judgmental neighbors. For the wealthy, rouge could be made from red lead or cinnabar, both of which were incredibly toxic. But the logic went something like I may die young, but I'll die pink-cheeked and socially respected. Rouge was typically applied with cloth, fingers, or whatever tool was available that hadn't just been used to season a stew. Mirror access was limited. So many women relied on instinct, muscle memory, or the occasional honest maid. Of course, if your blush was too visible, you might be accused of imitating prostitutes, or worse, French courtiers. The goal was always modest enhancement, not theatrical statement. And if someone complimented your glow, you were expected to deny everything and mutter something about the wind. Even nuns occasionally wore a touch of rouge discreetly, and supposedly only on feast days, because nothing says I serve the Lord like a tasteful dab of beetroot behind a cloister. In medieval Europe, if your hair didn't look like it had been kissed by holy light or stolen from a Botticelli angel, you were already starting from behind. Blonde hair, in particular, was the medieval gold standard. It was associated with youth, beauty, virtue, and in case you needed divine backup. The Virgin Mary was frequently painted as a blonde, even though she was, geographically speaking, almost certainly not. But realism was less important than radiance. If you were born blonde, congratulations, you were considered blessed and probably got out of a few chores. But natural blindness didn't last, especially in adulthood. So medieval women took matters into their own hands and sometimes cauldrons. Homemade hair lightening concoctions included saffron, chamomile, ash, honey, and lye, applied liberally, then left to bake under the sun in a method known as sun basking. It worked best if you had the patience of a nun and the skin of a salamander. Some recipes also included urine, which was thought to help lift color. Whose urine? That part was less regulated, but as long as it gave your hair that celestial shimmer, it was deemed worth it. Beauty is, and always has been, a little bit disgusting. Hair texture mattered too. Loose, long, wavy locks were the ideal, preferably cascading down your back like a divine curtain. But this luxury was reserved for unmarried women. Once married, your golden mane was to be hidden under veils, nets, and head wraps. Because apparently the moment you said "I do," your hair became a national security risk. For noble women, hair was often braided, twisted, or tucked into elaborate styles, especially when attending court or religious events. These hairstyles were frequently accessorized with silk ribbons, beads, or embroidery, just in case you needed to remind a room you didn't shear sheep for a living. Men weren't left out either, while not quite as judged. Men with thick golden locks were often romanticized in poetry and art. Knights with flowing hair charging into battle with a medieval version of shampoo commercials. In medieval Europe, hair was a lot like money. If you had it, you didn't necessarily show it off unless you were trying to get married. Then suddenly it became a strategic asset. Unmarried women were encouraged to wear their hair long and loose as a symbol of purity and innocence, though not too loose. Unless you were going for the ethereal forest maiden look, which was only socially acceptable if you were, say, an actual ST, or being Marta. Otherwise, a gentle braid would suffice. But once married, your hair was immediately banished from public view. Congratulations, you now have a husband and an obligation to wrap your locks tighter than a monastery's wine budget. Enter the world of veils, wimples, nets, and coifs. A medieval wardrobe of modesty that could make even the most radiant blonde disappear under 3 layers of beige linen. These coverings weren't just modest, they were practical. They protected hair from smoke, lice, and unsolicited compliments for troubadours. The most dedicated women layered their coverings. A coif, a close-fitting cap, might be worn under a veil, which could then be pinned beneath a wimple that wrapped under the chin. The effect? You looked like a pious, well-bundled sandwich, and that was the goal. But fashion is rarely satisfied with just function. As time went on, headwear got more elaborate. Nets were embroidered with gold thread. Veils were starched into geometric shapes. Some noble women wore silken cages for their braids, accessorized with jewels and tiny bells because nothing says subtle beauty like jingling when you turn your head in many cultures. Concealed hair was tied to morality. A covered head was seen as modest and virtuous. Exposed hair on a married woman, however, could get you compared to a lady of the night, or worse, a French woman. Of course, some women rebelled. They would let a little curl slip out or wear translucent veils that technically counted as covered, while still letting the world admire their carefully dyed strands. Medieval loopholes were alive and well. If medieval beauty had one unspoken rule, it was this: taller is nobler, and we're not talking about your legs. By the 15th century, women across Europe began embracing a fashion trend that quite literally elevated their appearance. The hennin. You know the one. Those towering cone-shaped hats that looked like they were designed by someone who spent too much time around church steeples. The hennin wasn't just headwear. It was a social ladder you wore. These hats could reach upwards of 2 feet, sometimes even more, especially among the French and Burgundian elite. The taller the hennin, the higher your status, and the more doors you smacked into on your way to dinner. Often made from fine silk, velvet, or brocade, hennins were structured with wire frames, giving them that dangerously aerodynamic shape, a sheer veil, usually cascaded from the tip, adding movement, mystery, and a good chance of getting caught in candles. Now getting your hair to fit under one of these things was an art in itself. Hair was braided and stuffed up into the cone, or sometimes completely shaved around the forehead. Forehead real estate again to help the hennins sit properly. Comfort was not part of the design brief, but hennins weren't the only vertical obsession. Some women wore heart-shaped escorts, which looked like 2 croissants glued to either side of the head, or butterfly hens, where veils were spread out like wings. Great for drama, not so much for rain. Outside of nobility, most women stuck with veils, linen caps, or circlets. Simpler, less dangerous, and less likely to be mistaken for a siege weapon. Clergy and conservative thinkers, as expected, were less than enthused. They warned that such ostentation invited vanity, sin, and possibly neck strain. Still, hennins remained popular among those who could afford them, much like most terrible but fashionable ideas throughout history. And while men didn't wear towering cones, they had their own style statements. Think feathered caps, fur-trimmed hoods, and pointy shoes that could double as fencing equipment. In medieval times, a woman's ideal body wasn't meant to be athletic, curvy, or toned. No, the goal was to appear delicate, demure, and possibly recovering from a fainting spell. The ideal figure was slim, soft, and slightly ethereal, like someone who lived on honey water, courtly poems, and perhaps one figure week. Beauty manuals didn't advise women to build strength or endurance. The only lifting expected of you was lifting your veil in a flirtatious gesture before swiftly looking away and maybe swooning. But this wasn't about looking sickly, at least not obviously. The sweet spot was somewhere between too weak to carry a bucket and still able to play the lute while sitting. A graceful, willowy figure was associated with nobility, because of course, if you were working, you'd have broader shoulders, stronger arms, and the misfortune of muscle tone. The emphasis was on a narrow waist, soft curves, and a general air of spiritual exhaustion. Waistlines on dresses were often cinched just below the bust, an early version of the empire waist to elongate the torso and give the illusion of height and fragility. And if that illusion needed help, tight lacing was available. Not quite corsets. Those came later, but tightly bound kirtles and surcoats did the job just fine. Being too thin, however, wasn't the goal either in times of famine or plague. Being very thin was a red flag, as if that person might be actively dying. A small hint of roundness, particularly in the face or hips, was considered healthy and fertile. Basically, if you looked like you could survive winter and still be poetic, you were in the sweet spot. Diet advice from the time wasn't exactly balanced. Beauty manuals recommended things like eating fennel for digestion, rose petals for breath, and drinking wine to improve complexion. Protein only if it had a feather still attached. Men, on the other hand, were allowed to have more substance, broad shoulders, strong legs, and the ability to carry a sword without toppling over. But even then, nobility preferred a lean frame with refined posture, not brute strength. In the Middle Ages, a woman's eyes were her silent power, the medieval version of sending a flirty emoji. Only with more spiritual implications and slightly less blinking, the ideal medieval eyes were large, clear, and soulful, the kind that seemed to whisper, "I'm full of virtue," and maybe just a hint of melancholy. Think of eyes that looked as if they had personally witnessed the fall of man and were still politely recovering. Poets of the period couldn't get enough of them. They described eyes as luminous orbs, dewdrops of heaven, or pools of pure devotion. What they rarely said was bloodshot, allergy-ridden, or I was up all night churning butter. Light-colored eyes, blue or gray, were often idealized in Northern Europe, associated with innocence, purity, and the general assumption that you hadn't seen too many disturbing things, or at least pretended not to. In Southern Europe, darker eyes were admired too, especially if they came paired with a noble lineage and a good dowry. Enhancing the eyes was challenging. There were no medieval eyeliner pens, just charcoal, soot, and optimism. Some women dabbed a little black powder around the lashes to make the eyes look bigger, risking irritation, blurry vision, or starting the world's first accidental smoky eye. But most women relied on nature and strategic lighting. Want to look more wide-eyed? Stand near a candle. Want to look virtuous? Look downward at all times, even if you trip over the cat. Interestingly, slightly teary eyes were admired. It suggested emotional sensitivity, piety, and perhaps that you just finished praying or reading something uplifting like a 300-line poem about chastity. Artificial tears weren't available, but staring directly into smoke or enduring mild public humiliation usually did the trick as for eye contact. It was a delicate dance. Too much could be seen as bold, flirtatious, or suspiciously French. Too little, and you risked seeming shifty or possessed. The trick was to occasionally glance up from beneath lowered lids, like someone who'd memorized the Bible but wasn't about to brag. Let's talk about something rarely mentioned in medieval love poetry: breath. Specifically, what it smelled like. While a knight might wax lyrical about his lady's rosebud lips or pearl-like teeth, he usually skipped over what happened when those lips opened. That's because medieval dental hygiene was, at best, an aspirational concept, and minty freshness wasn't invented yet, unless you count standing near a herb garden and hoping for the best. Still, fresh breath was technically considered desirable. A gentle, sweet-smelling mouth hinted at youth, health, and that you probably hadn't eaten garlic and eels for breakfast, though statistically you had. Medieval women did what they could. They chewed parsley, fennel seeds, cloves, cinnamon sticks, and occasionally twigs, not just for the taste, but to keep the mouth tolerable. Think of it as the pre-mint version of gum. It didn't sparkle your teeth, but it made you slightly more kissable, or at least less terrifying in close conversation. For those with access to apothecaries, there were also herbal pastes and mouth rinses made from sage, vinegar, and myrrh. These were applied sparingly, both because they were expensive and because opening your mouth too wide in public was considered a bit much. Toothbrushing, as we know it, wasn't standard. Instead, people wiped their teeth with cloth, rubbed them with chalk or crushed herbs, or used chew sticks, small fibrous twigs that could scrub and double as something to fidget with while your suitor recited bad poetry. And while halitosis wasn't exactly romantic, it wasn't considered shocking either. After all, everyone had bad breath to some degree, and they all had bigger problems, like surviving winter or avoiding being burned as a heretic. For noble women, the trick was to minimize offense while maintaining grace. Conversations took place at arm's length. Public affection was limited, and when in doubt, fan yourself and look contemplative. Bonus points if you carried a small pomander, a scented orb filled with herbs, to wave gently in your own direction as needed. In modern times, a great smile can launch 1,000 dating apps. In the Middle Ages, a smile was a risky endeavor, best used sparingly, like spices or peasant revolts. Why? Well, medieval dental hygiene wasn't exactly flourishing. Teeth were important, yes, but more for chewing bread than charming suitors. Most people had teeth that ranged from slightly questionable to actively terrifying, especially by age 30. So the fewer people saw them, the better. This wasn't entirely due to negligence. Tooth decay was rampant thanks to diets heavy in bread, porridge and meat, and lacking in toothbrushes, dental floss, or literally any kind of fluoride. Sugar wasn't widely consumed yet in most of Europe, but even basic starches broke down into tooth-tarnishing misery. Also, dental surgery at the time was essentially an exorcism with pliers. Despite this, a healthy smile was quietly admired, just not loudly celebrated. White, even teeth were rare, and seen as a mark of youth and fortune, and perhaps a miracle. But people weren't going around flashing big toothy grins like medieval toothpaste commercials. In fact, a demure closed-lip smile was far more fashionable. I think I might be contemplating a sonnet rather than I'm thrilled to be here. Some women even used powders made of sage, salt, or ground up coral to try and clean or whiten their teeth. These methods were mildly effective and mostly abrasive. Imagine brushing with sand and hoping for the best. But overall, teeth were tolerated, not flaunted. Medieval art, for instance, almost never depicts open-mouthed smiles. Even saints and angels usually keep their mouths politely closed, as if they too were quietly aware of the risks of showing molars. Men weren't immune either. A knight might win the heart of a lady with his bravery and chiseled jawline, but no ballad ever included the line. His bicuspids gleamed like ivory. There's a reason troubadours sang about eyes, hair, and hands, not breath and bite alignment. When it came to medieval beauty standards for men, the expectations were oddly specific. You didn't need to be chiseled like a Greek statue, but you also couldn't look like you'd just fallen off a hay cart. The sweet spot was somewhere between ready to joust and could write a poem about jousting without actually doing it. The ideal man was tall, lean, broad-shouldered, and very importantly, nobly unbothered. Not overly muscular. That suggested labor, but not soft either. That suggested laziness, or too much mead. You wanted to look like you could swing a sword, but only if the squire was busy. A defined jawline, high cheekbones, and a straight nose were all considered attractive. Think Prince. In an illuminated manuscript rather than a village strongman, a well-groomed beard or a smooth, clean-shaven face was acceptable, depending on the region and era. But either way, it needed to look intentional, not like you'd been lost in the woods for a week. Hair was typically shoulder-length and styled, especially for noblemen. Curls were in fashion in many courts, especially if they occurred naturally or looked like they did. Some men even used curling irons. Yes, really. Small heated rods or herbal rinses to enhance texture and shine. Because nothing says I'm above manual labor, like sitting for 45 minutes while your page boy styles your fringe. Clothing played a huge role in enhancing the male silhouette. Padded shoulders, cinched waists, and fitted tunics helped create the ideal body shape with extra emphasis on posture. A nobleman did not slouch. He glided, often with a hint of disdain. And if a man did happen to be naturally muscular, that was fine, as long as he wasn't caught actually working with those muscles. Fighting in wars was acceptable. Hauling barrels was not. Above all, the look was effortless. You weren't supposed to try to be attractive. You were simply born noble, and that alone made you appealing. A kind of medieval version of hot without trying, except instead of a gym membership. You inherited land and a falcon. In an era where bathing was technically optional and plumbing was mostly a dream with a Latin name, scent management became an art form, and not the glamorous walk through a cloud of Chanel No. 5 kinds of art, more the mascot and prayer variety. To be fair, people did bathe, just not as often as we hope, especially depending on the century, location, and plague frequency. So, to keep from offending nostrils, human and divine, medieval men and women turned to the olfactory power of herbs, oils, and perfume pouches. Let's begin with a pomander, a small hollow ball made of metal, worn in a chain or pinned to clothing, and filled with strongly scented herbs like cloves, rosemary, cinnamon, sage, and occasionally something ominously labeled powder of roses. These weren't just for elegance, they were portable smell shields. Think of them as the medieval version of walking around with a Fabrizzi grenade. The nobility also favored perfumed gloves, handkerchiefs, and even scented combs. Everything was fair game for aroma enhancement, including hair, which was sometimes doused with floral waters or vinegar infusions that smelled slightly better than sweat and desperation. Speaking of sweat, yes, people absolutely sweated. Medieval garments were heavy, summers were hot, and deodorant was still several centuries away from reinventing armpits. The solution? Layers of linen, which absorbed sweat and could be washed more frequently than the woolen or silk outer garments. Some added herbal sachets to their underlayers, hoping to combat odor with fragrant optimism. Bathhouses were a thing, especially during the early medieval and late medieval periods, but access varied wildly. The church eventually frowned upon communal nudity, which really put a damper on hygiene enthusiasm. So many turned to dry bathing, which is exactly as unrefreshing as it sounds, wiping yourself with a cloth, then spritzing on scented water and pretending that it counted. And then there were the overachievers, people who kept flower petals in their shoes or stuffed herbs in their bed linens to smell vaguely like someone who had recently seen a garden in medieval Europe. Beauty wasn't just skin deep, it was morally loaded. A well-composed face could be a divine blessing, a social weapon, or a trap set by the devil himself. Sometimes all three before breakfast. To be beautiful was to walk a very fine line. On one hand, physical beauty, clear skin, symmetrical features, and pale complexion was considered a sign of virtue. If you were lovely, it meant you were blessed, possibly chosen by God, or at the very least, unlikely to steal sheep. Poets, preachers, and painters alike described beauty as evidence of a pure soul. But there was a catch. If you knew you were beautiful, or worse, if you used that beauty to your advantage, you immediately became suspect. Vanity was a sin, remember, and showing too much interest in one's appearance hinted at pride, seduction, or worst of all, French tendencies. Medieval sermons warned that women's beauty could tempt men into sin, which, of course, was entirely the woman's fault. You set a precedent, and medieval Europe ran with it for a solid 1,000 years. A woman wearing makeup, showing a bit of hair, or fluttering her lashes at the wrong night could easily find herself accused of being everything from immoral to outright demonic. Some even believed that beauty could be an illusion, a sorceress's disguise, a glamour conjured by witches to lead righteous men astray. This may sound dramatic, but remember, this was a time when bad weather could get you burned at the stake. Conversely, those who were plain or ill-featured were sometimes assumed to be morally deficient or just unfortunate. The idea that outward appearance reflected in a character wasn't just popular. It was doctrine in some circles. Beauty meant grace. Ugliness meant punishment, illness, or divine disappointment. Of course, all of this made things spectacularly confusing. Be beautiful, but don't try too hard. Glow with virtue, but not so much that it looks like pride. And above all, never look more attractive than the local lord's wife. That was a one-way ticket to a silent convent or an unusually convenient illness. So in the end, medieval beauty standards weren't just about aesthetics. They were a full-blown moral tightrope, balancing vanity, virtue, and whatever powdered lead was left in your makeup kit. The Persian immortals were more than just elite troops. They were a statement, a living symbol of imperial strength, precision, and unyielding continuity. Their origins trace back to the very birth of the Achaemenid Empire under Cyrus the Great in the 6th century BCE. At a time when Persia was rapidly transforming from a regional power into a sprawling imperial juggernaut, Cyrus understood something vital. An empire needs a backbone, not just administrators and governors, but an elite force that could project dominance, inspire loyalty, and suppress rebellion with equal efficiency. Thus, the Immortals were born. The name Immortals wasn't just a bit of royal flair. It was a logistical and psychological masterpiece. According to Herodotus, their strength was always kept exactly at 10,000 men. If one man died, fell ill, or was wounded, he was instantly replaced. The numbers never wavered. From the outside, it seemed they could not be diminished, could not be weakened, and above all, could not die. Whether myth or clever bookkeeping, the image stuck and the name endured. Immortality in this case wasn't about individual survival. It was about the eternal presence of Persian might. These men weren't random conscripts. To be an immortal meant being selected from among the Persian nobility, or at least from families of high status and proven loyalty. Training began young. Discipline was brutal, loyalty to the king unquestionable. They were expected to be not just warriors, but exemplars of Achaemenid values, order, obedience, and composure under pressure. They were also richly dressed, robes of fine materials, scale armor beneath their garments, and often armed with a spear, bow, short sword, and a wicker shield. Their appearance was as calculated as their tactics. Persian kings weren't just sending warriors into battle. They were sending a mobile political message wrapped in silk and steel. From the plains of Lydia to the deserts of Egypt, wherever the Persian Empire expanded, the Immortals followed. They stood behind kings, beside thrones, and at the front of the battlefield. If you saw them approaching, you didn't just see soldiers. You saw the unbroken heartbeat of the empire. Immortals didn't blink. Immortals didn't retreat. Immortals endured. And that's exactly what made them terrifying. The appearance of the Persian Immortals was no accident. It was psychological warfare. These men weren't covered head to toe in gleaming bronze like Greek hoplites. No, the immortals looked otherworldly, like a wave of richly dressed shadows sweeping across the land. Their uniforms blended regal flair with military function. They wore elaborately embroidered tunics and trousers, often dyed in rich reds and purples, colors of nobility and command. Beneath these lay a layer of scale armor made of bronze or iron, flexible enough for movement but deadly in close combat. Their shields were made from woven wicker, deceptively light, yet able to deflect arrows and absorb blows. Their most distinctive element, however, was their headdress, a soft felt cap called a tiara, sometimes pulled over the face to obscure identity. Unlike the Greeks who glorified individuality in armor and valor, the immortals thrived in uniformity. 10,000 men, moving in near silence, all similarly armed and armored, created a visual spectacle that overwhelmed the senses. It was like watching a curtain of death descend on the battlefield. Each immortal carried a short spear, a bow with a quiver of arrows, and a short sword or akinaka at their belt. But perhaps most impressive was their ability to move quickly and remain deadly in almost any terrain. Their training emphasized agility and endurance over brute strength. They could march across entire provinces without breaking formation, and unlike many ancient forces, the immortals were equally comfortable fighting in open battle or serving as imperial guards in royal courts. Their equipment was light enough to ensure swift deployment, but potent enough to intimidate and destroy. It wasn't about brute force. It was about consistency, about never failing, never staggering, and never seeming vulnerable. And that consistency, combined with the mystery of their appearance, helped forge their legend. When they marched into battle, drums would pound and dust would rise behind them, but their expressions remained eerily composed. No roaring, no boasting, just eerie, synchronized precision. It was as though they were not men, but machines, crafted not in flesh, but in discipline, ritual, and fear. To face the immortals wasn't simply to face death. It was to face a concept that some armies didn't just fight. They endured without pause or pity. To be an immortal was not just a job, it was a lifelong identity, a status symbol, and in some ways a sentence. While they were revered and richly rewarded, the expectations were immense. These men lived under constant scrutiny. Their food, clothing, and housing were all provided by the state, but not out of kindness. It was to ensure absolute control. From the moment they entered the ranks, they belonged not to their families, but to the empire. Most immortals came from Persian, Median, or Elamite nobility, but lower-ranking sons of loyal families could rise into the ranks if they showed exceptional discipline. Training began in childhood, often within military academies attached to the royal court. Boys learned archery on horseback, how to endure pain and hunger, how to march in step, and most importantly, how to obey without hesitation. There was no room for glory-seeking or personal ambition. An immortal who stood out too much was corrected. The formation was sacred. Unity came above all. Discipline ruled every corner of their lives. They followed a strict daily routine. Wake before dawn, drill in silence, maintain weapons and armor. Meals were eaten communally, always modest, always nutritionally calculated for endurance. Meat, flatbread, dates and wine were staples, but luxuries were discouraged. The empire needed warriors, not pampered aristocrats. When not on campaign, the immortals served as guards for the king and his court. But even then, their duties were more than ceremonial. They stood watch for assassination attempts, monitored nobles for disloyalty, and maintained order in the most volatile places of the empire. Their mere presence could silence dissent in a royal hall. They were the eyes and ears of the Achaemenid ruler, trained to detect lies, sense fear, and act decisively. Interestingly, they weren't entirely cut off from family life. Immortals were allowed to marry and maintain households. However, they could be summoned at a moment's notice. When duty called, they left everything behind. No questions asked. A man who hesitated even once could be quietly replaced. After all, the number always had to remain at 10,000. No gaps, no delays. It was this cold, efficient system that ensured their mythos. They didn't just fight with discipline. They lived in discipline. They were tools of the empire, honed, polished, and sharpened until nothing remained but duty. If Cyrus the Great created the immortals, it was Darius the Great who perfected them. When Darius rose to power in 522 BCE, amid palace intrigue and assassination, the immortals were the tool he used to legitimize and stabilize his reign. They were no longer just a personal guard. They were an extension of royal authority, woven directly into the fabric of his expanding imperial bureaucracy. Darius understood that power didn't only rest on military strength, but on the illusion of order and inevitability, and nothing projected that image more effectively than the immortals. He paraded them at festivals, had them stationed prominently around his new capital of Persepolis, and sent them on high-profile missions. They were always visible, always composed, always the same. 10,000 eternal faces of Persian dominance. But Darius also reshaped their tactical role. Under his leadership, the immortals became a core element of Persian combined arms warfare. No longer just elite infantry, they were often deployed alongside archers, cavalry, and chariotry in coordinated strikes. Darius placed immense value on strategic flexibility, and the immortals had to adapt. They trained more rigorously in ranged combat, siege warfare, and battlefield coordination. Reports from later Greek observers describe how they moved with terrifying efficiency, firing arrows and volleys while slowly advancing behind their wicker shields, never breaking formation. They also became heavily involved in suppressing rebellions. Darius's empire stretched from Egypt to the Indus Valley, and revolts were frequent. The immortals were often the first wave of retaliation. In Elam, Babylon, and Scythia, they acted as both punishment and message. The empire is watching, and the king's will is inexhaustible. It was under Darius that they earned a darker reputation, not just elite warriors, but instruments of fear and retribution. Even their iconography was elevated. Carvings at Persepolis show them in perfect lines, stylized and identical, facing eternity in stone. These weren't mere portraits, they were propaganda. Darius wanted every subject and visitor to know these men are always here, always armed, and they do not die. Step out of line and you'll meet 1 or 10,000. Through Darius, the immortals became more than a military unit. They were institutionalized fear, woven into the royal image, deployed with surgical precision and wrapped in gold-threaded silence. The Persian immortals reached the height of their legend during the reign of Xerxes the Great, and nowhere was their reputation more fiercely tested than at the narrow mountain pass of Thermopylae in 480 BC. This battle, now mythologized through centuries of art and cinema, wasn't just a clash of armies. It was a symbolic collision between two radically different worldviews, Persian imperial order versus Greek city-state defiance. And at the center of the storm stood the immortals. When Xerxes invaded Greece with what ancient sources claim was the largest army the world had ever seen, he brought the immortals as his personal vanguard. They didn't just guard him, they were a scalpel in the heart of chaos. Their reputation alone preceded them. The Greeks had heard of the 10,000 who never died, the elite troops who served kings like gods and fought with flawless precision. At Thermopylae, they met resistance that rattled their mythos. King Leonidas and his few thousand Greeks, most famously 300 Spartans, held a narrow pass against wave after wave of Persian attacks. On the second day of battle, Xerxes ordered the immortals to break the Greek line. It was meant to be a crushing blow. After all, these were the elite of the elite. But what followed was not the instant rout Xerxes expected. The immortals, skilled as they were constrained by the tight geography of the pass. Their bows were nearly useless in such confined space, and their shorter spears couldn't reach past the long dory of the Greek hoplites. For hours, they clashed with disciplined Spartans who fought in tight, interlocking phalanxes. Trained from childhood for exactly this kind of combat, the immortals suffered losses, heavy ones. Herodotus noted, perhaps with some glee, that they were no more successful than the ordinary troops. It wasn't just a military defeat, it was a rupture in their image. The immortals had always appeared untouchable, gods of war in silk and scale, but at Thermopylae they bled, they died, and for the first time. The illusion of their immortality cracked under the weight of Spartan spears and Greek defiance. Yet even in defeat, they remained terrifying. They adapted, they regrouped, and they marched again. Immortality, after all, wasn't about invincibility. It was about endurance. The most fascinating part of the Persian immortals wasn't just their training or battlefield tactics. It was their system. What truly made them immortal wasn't magic or divine favor. It was administration. Cold, efficient, relentless bureaucracy. When one immortal fell, whether in battle due to illness or by retirement, another took his place instantly. No mourning, no ceremony, just a seamless substitution. The total number always remained exactly 10,000. This wasn't a poetic exaggeration. It was by design. The Achaemenid Empire ran on logistics, and the Immortals were the prime example. They had a constantly maintained pool of trainees and understudies, young men being groomed to fill vacancies the moment they appeared. These replacements were kept in the capital, supervised, drilled and rotated through lesser duties until called up. This internal structure made the Immortals far more than a static elite unit. They were a living system of excellence, always regenerating, always evolving. To facilitate this, records were kept with meticulous care. Officers known as Hazarapidas, literally commanders of 1,000, oversaw recruitment, discipline, and supply. There were 10 such commanders beneath the overall leader of the Immortals. Below them, a web of subcommanders, scribes, and quartermasters ensured every man had the correct arms, rations, lodging, and medical support. Lose a man in Egypt. A replacement is dispatched from Susa. A soldier breaks a leg during patrol in Media. His successor is already packing his gear. This machinery extended beyond just military readiness. It was psychological. The illusion of 10,000 unchanging warriors was a tool of imperial terror. If you killed one, another immediately stepped into his place. It didn't matter who they were individually. The identity was irrelevant. The presence was eternal. Like a hydra of discipline and silk, the Immortals created the illusion of unstoppable force because the machine never paused to grieve. Even off the battlefield, this system functioned flawlessly. If an Immortal's family became disloyal or politically compromised, he was quietly removed and replaced. No scandal, no drama. The line moved forward as if nothing had changed this mechanism. So alien compared to the glory-seeking Greek ethos was perhaps the Immortals' greatest strength, not skill, not courage, but the cold certainty that they could never truly disappear. While the Persian Immortals are remembered as warriors, they were also something far subtler, diplomats in armor. In the Achaemenid worldview, military force wasn't just about conquest, it was about presence. And the Immortals were often deployed not just to fight, but to be seen, to enter foreign courts as living representations of Persian elegance and power. Their silken robes, gilded weapons, and perfect discipline made them terrifying in battle, but mesmerizing in peace. When ambassadors arrived in foreign lands, the Immortals often accompanied them, not for protection, but as spectacle. Imagine a small elite escort entering a Greek or Babylonian city. 10 men, perfectly synchronized, dressed not in rough leather or blood-stained bronze, but in fine tunics laced with gold, silent and unreadable behind their soft felt headdresses. They didn't shout or threaten. They didn't need to. Their very existence was a negotiation. In satrapies provinces, Immortals were regularly stationed to remind local governors where true power resided. They rarely interfered with civil rule, but they were always there watching. A whisper of sedition could bring a squad of them to a governor's door. Rebellion in the provinces was often stopped before it began, simply because the alternative, facing the Immortals, was too dreadful to consider. Even within the royal court, their presence was multifunctional. They acted as ceremonial guards during Nora's festivals, coronations, and diplomatic receptions. But behind the scenes, they monitored courtiers, sniffed out treason, and enforced the king's will with silent efficiency. Some historians argue they acted almost like an internal intelligence agency, an ever-present warning that loyalty was not optional. This dual identity, warrior and envoy, enforcer and ornament, was part of their genius. Unlike most elite units of ancient times, who lived for the glory of battle alone, the Immortals served a much broader imperial strategy. War was just one tool. Theirs was an empire held together not just by swords, but by symbols. The immortals understood that fear and awe are siblings. In foreign courts and remote palaces, their arrival sent a clear message. The king is watching, the empire is eternal, and resistance is not worth the cost. And in this way, they fought wars without ever unsheathing a blade. All empires age, and so do their legends. By the later years of the Achaemenid Empire, the immortals were still feared, still respected, but no longer invincible. The machinery that had once made them immortal began to rust, not with a dramatic collapse, but with slow, creeping inefficiency. As Persian kings grew increasingly detached from the battlefield, more concerned with courtly luxury and intrigue, the immortals too began to shift from hardened warriors into royal ornaments. Under kings like Artaxerxes and Darius III, the elite guards still existed, still dressed the part, still marched in perfect formation. But cracks had formed. Recruitment standards slipped. Political favoritism began to seep into their ranks. Where once only the most disciplined and loyal men were selected, now nobles pulled strings to place unworthy sons into the sacred 10,000. The result was subtle, but fatal. Uniformity without spirit, discipline without heart. This decay became tragically obvious when Alexander the Great launched his invasion of Persia in 334 BCE. At the Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BCE, the immortals were deployed alongside the Persian center to defend Darius III, and although they fought with courage, they could not hold against the tactical brilliance and ruthless momentum of Alexander's Macedonian phalanx. They were outflanked, outmaneuvered, and overwhelmed. Worse yet, the myth didn't survive the battle. For centuries, the name Immortals had inspired awe. But Gaugamela proved they were no longer what they had been under Cyrus the Great or Xerxes I. The machinery of instant replacement faltered. The backup system that once made their losses invisible simply wasn't in place anymore. The unit never recovered. When Alexander marched into Persepolis and took the royal palace, he walked into a shell of an empire. The immortals weren't there to defend it. The unbroken line had finally been broken. But their story didn't end with defeat. Elements of the immortals lived on. Alexander co-opted Persian traditions into his army. Later in the Sasanian Empire, a new elite force would rise, sometimes even called immortals again by historians. Though not direct descendants, they echoed the original myth. 10,000 strong, elite, fearsome, eternal, even in their fall. The immortals left a blueprint. They had shown the world how to build not just an army, but a legend. The Persian immortals may have vanished from the battlefield, but their influence never disappeared. Long after the fall of the Achaemenid Empire, the idea of an unbreakable elite fighting force remained lodged in the imagination of generals, kings, and storytellers alike. Their legend endured not because they won every battle, but because they represented something larger. The perfection of state-controlled power. An army that didn't age, didn't question, and didn't falter. When the Greeks described them, it was with a mix of awe and suspicion. Herodotus called them immortals, not because they could not be killed, but because they could not be seen to die. Their replacements were immediate, their presence eternal. To the Greeks, this was eerie, almost unnatural. They were used to war as a chaotic personal affair. The immortals were something else, precise, faceless, disciplined to the edge of humanity. In Roman times, scholars still reference the immortals when speaking of ancient power. Even Byzantine historians noted the structure of the Persian elite guard as something to be admired. And in the early Islamic period, Arab historians recounted tales of the 10,000, who had once guarded kings of old, their spears glinting like a forest of silver under the desert sun. The concept would be revived again in the Sasanian Empire, where an elite cavalry corps, sometimes referred to by historians as the New Immortals, served as the empire's armored fist. Though not directly descended from the Achaemenid unit, they carried the same mission, embodying imperial invincibility. Even Napoleon Bonaparte centuries later studied Persian military organization and praised their structure. Culturally, the immortals seeped into myth. Modern media often misrepresents them, turning them into monsters, demons, or masked assassins. But the truth was far more compelling. They were human, terrifyingly human. Ordinary men turned into instruments of empire through relentless training, psychological control, and a deeply embedded system of continuity. They didn't need magic to become legendary, just consistency and silence. Their greatest weapon wasn't their sword. It was the idea that they were always coming, an eternal shadow on the horizon. And so the immortals live on in stone carvings, in battle doctrines, and in the whispered fears of those who know that power, when well organized and endlessly replaced, can become something very close to immortality. Before there were legends of Greek Amazons, there were the Scythians, nomadic warriors of the Eurasian steppe, feared and respected from the Black Sea to the Altai Mountains. Unlike most ancient societies, Scythian women didn't stay behind the tents weaving cloth or raising children. They rode horses, wielded bows, and went to war. And they didn't just accompany men into battle. They led and fought with lethal skill. These were not exceptions. This was the culture. Greek historians like Herodotus were stunned when they encountered these women. He described entire tribes where women refused to marry unless they had first killed an enemy in combat. His words, originally intended as exotic curiosities, have since found archaeological proof. Burial mounds called kurgans, scattered across Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and southern Russia, have yielded astonishing finds. The skeletons of young women buried with bows, arrows, swords, and even battle-inflicted injuries. One such discovery revealed a woman with an arrowhead lodged in her spine, her body armored, her grave richly furnished. These weren't ceremonial weapons. They had been used, and so had she. Scythian society was fundamentally different from its contemporaries. Life on the steppe demanded mobility and resilience. Everyone, male or female, had to ride, hunt, and defend a tribe. Girls learned archery as young as boys did. They wore the same leather trousers, the same armor. They even wore their hair and tattoos in similar fashion, indistinguishable on horseback under a storm of arrows. This created a warrior culture in which gender roles were fluid on the battlefield, but strict off it. A Scythian woman could be deadly at full gallop, and then return home to fulfill ritual and maternal duties. The two roles were not in conflict. They were complementary. Greek myths of the Amazons may have been inspired by exaggerated encounters with Scythian women, but while the Amazons of myth vanished into fantasy, the Scythians were real. They fought Persians, clashed with Greeks, and terrified the Macedonians. And for centuries they roamed the steppe with fire and fury, men and women alike. In the small West African kingdom of Dahomey, modern-day Benin, an army of women once struck fear into European colonizers, rival kingdoms, and anyone foolish enough to underestimate them. They were known as the Igogi, but the French nicknamed them the Dahomey Amazons in comparison to the Greek myths. But these warriors were very real. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the Igogi had become the standing royal guard of Dahomey's king. But they weren't just guards. They were elite infantry, trained to kill, to defend, and to never retreat. Initially, they may have started as elephant hunters or palace attendants, but over time they evolved into a formal, feared military force. Recruited as young girls, often chosen for their strength or spirit, the Igogi was separated from families and placed into intense training. Discipline was total. They ran obstacle courses filled with thorns, sparred with real blades, and swore oaths of celibacy and absolute loyalty to the king. They wore braided sashes and carried muskets, machetes, and clubs. But their deadliest weapon was psychological. European observers during the 19th century were shocked by their fearlessness and brutality. One French officer noted with unease how a Dahomey Amazon rushed forward, ripped open a man's throat, then calmly wiped her blade. These were not symbolic warriors. They were frontline shock troops used in raids, battles, and ambushes. During the Franco-Dahomeyan Wars in the 1890s, the Igogi went toe-to-toe with French colonial troops. Outnumbered and outgunned, they still launched night raids, executed ambushes, and fought street fights to defend their kingdom. Their tenacity forced French commanders to reconsider their tactics and their assumptions about gender in combat. But it wasn't just their battlefield success that mattered. The Dahomey Amazons existed in a deeply patriarchal world, and yet they carved out a space of total autonomy and influence. They advised kings, they performed ceremonial duties, and they shaped the kingdom's foreign policy. not from behind the scenes, but with blades in hand. Though the French ultimately defeated Dahomey, the legend of the Igoji never died. In fact, their legacy helped inspire modern fictional warriors like the Dora Milaje in Marvel's Black Panther. But truth, as always, is more impressive than fiction. In the shadowy pages of Japan's medieval history, one woman rides through blood and legend alike. Tomo Gozen, a samurai warrior of the late 12th century, fought during the Genpei War, a brutal civil conflict between the Minamoto and Taira clans that gave birth to the first shogunate. Tomo wasn't a symbolic figure or a passive consort. She was a commander, a swordswoman, and an archer, trained in the deadly arts of the battlefield and feared for her precision in combat. Her story emerges most famously from the Heike Monogatari, a war epic that blends history with poetic flair. In it, Tomo is described as especially beautiful with white skin, long hair, and charming features. But the next sentence drops the real thunder. She was also a remarkably strong archer, and as a swordswoman, she was a warrior worth 1,000. Beauty and lethality weren't contradictions. They were fused. Tomo served under Minamoto no Yashinaka, a warlord and her possible lover, during his campaign to seize control of Kyoto. She wasn't a camp follower or a battlefield nurse. She was in the thick of it, reportedly leading troops and even slaying multiple enemies in single combat. At the Battle of Owazu in 1184, facing encirclement by rival Minamoto forces, Yashinaka ordered his last stand. Rather than flee, Tomo chose to fight. In one of her most famous encounters, she said to have dismounted a charging enemy horseman, wrestled him to the ground, and beheaded him on the spot. She then calmly remounted and continued into the chaos. That moment, possibly embellished, possibly true, has endured for centuries as a symbol of her unmatched composure and skill. But what happened to Tomo after the war remains a mystery. Some say she was captured and forced into marriage. Others say she became a nun, retreating into silence. Still others believe she vanished like a ghost, back into the mists of legend. Whatever the truth, the legacy of Tomo Gozen survived in theater, folklore, and national memory. In a society built on rigid gender roles and patriarchal control, Tomo Gozen stood apart, blade drawn, head high, and utterly unafraid. She wasn't just fighting for her lord, she was fighting for her right to exist in a world that told her she shouldn't. In the 1st century CE, the Roman Empire was at its peak, disciplined, organized, and seemingly unstoppable. But then came Boudica, a flame-haired Celtic queen from Britannia, who nearly brought the Roman machine to its knees. Her name would echo through history as a symbol of raw vengeance, national pride, and the terrifying force of a woman with nothing left to lose. Boudica was the wife of Prasutagus, king of the Iceni tribe in what is now eastern England. He was a client king under Rome, a puppet ruler allowed to maintain power as long as he kept the peace. But when Prasutagus died, Rome ignored his will and moved to seize his lands outright. In the process, Roman officials flogged Boudica publicly and, according to Tacitus, raped her daughters. It was a brutal humiliation designed to crush rebellion. Instead, it lit a wildfire. In 60 or 61 CE, Boudica united several British tribes and launched one of the most ferocious revolts in Roman history. And she wasn't a figurehead. Roman accounts describe her leading her army from a chariot, spear in hand, dressed in a flowing tunic and a massive gold torque around her neck. Her fiery hair streamed behind her as she rode, calling her people to war. She was part priestess, part general, and all fury. Her forces descended on Camuloginum, modern Colchester, burning it to the ground. Next came Londinium, the seat of modern London, where she slaughtered Roman colonists and razed the city. Historians estimate over 70,000 Romans and sympathizers were killed. In just a few months, her army left a trail of ash and shattered arrogance behind them. But the Romans, under Governor Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, regrouped. Despite being vastly outnumbered, they lured Boudica into a pitched battle where Roman discipline and formation tactics proved decisive. The rebellion was crushed. Boudica, facing defeat, is said to have taken poison rather than be captured, though her uprising failed. Boudica's legacy only grew. Roman historians painted her as a barbarian, and yet one whose courage and leadership were impossible to ignore. For the British, especially in later centuries, she became a symbol of resistance against tyranny, both foreign and domestic. In the war-ravaged steppes of Central Asia, During the golden age of Mongol expansion, there emerged a woman who terrified warriors and embarrassed princes. Not with a sword, but with sheer physical dominance. Her name was Kudalin, and she was the great-great-granddaughter of none other than Genghis Khan. But she didn't just ride in his shadow. She carved out a legend of her own, one headlock at a time. Born around 1260 CE, Kudalin was the daughter of Qaida Khan, a powerful cousin of Kublai Khan, and a rival claimant to leadership in the Mongol Empire. Kudalin was raised like a warrior prince, trained in archery, horse riding, and battlefield tactics. But she stood out most for her talent in wrestling, a deeply respected and highly competitive sport among the Mongols according to the Persian historian Rashid al-Din. Kudalin vowed she would only marry a man who could beat her in a wrestling match. Many tried, all failed. Dozens of suitors walked away, defeated and humiliated. Some even wagered horses, gold or herds on their chances. It's said she amassed 10,000 horses from her victories, turning her into not just a champion, but one of the wealthiest women on the steppe. But Kudalin wasn't just tossing men onto the dirt for fun. She fought alongside her father in real battles, commanding troops and breaking enemy lines during campaigns against both rival Mongol factions and Chinese forces. Kudalin was Kaidu's most trusted military advisor. He even considered naming her as his successor, an unprecedented move in a culture dominated by male warlords. This, unsurprisingly, sparked backlash. Some Mongol nobles whispered that her influence was unnatural, her power too threatening. In the end, Kaidu didn't make her his heir, choosing a male relative instead, but her reputation endured. Even Marco Polo, who traveled through the Mongol Empire, wrote of a Mongol princess who fought like a tiger and could ride and shoot as well as any man. Later, histories tried to romanticize or minimize her, turning her into a love-struck figure or reducing her story to legend. But make no mistake, Kudalin was real, and her strength was legendary. She proved that in the heart of the most male-dominated empire on Earth, a woman could still rise, not because she was allowed to, but because no one could stop her. In a time when women couldn't vote, own land freely, or even wear men's clothing without risking arrest, one French teenager not only wore armor, she led armies. Joan of Arc, born in 1412 in a tiny village called Domremy, was an illiterate peasant girl, but by the age of 17 she would command troops, confront kings, and bend the course of the 100 Years' War between France and England. Her rise wasn't born from military training or noble lineage. Joan claimed divine inspiration. She said she heard voices, those of saints like Michael, Catherine, and Margaret, who told her that she had been chosen to drive the English from France and crown Charles the Dauphin as king. It was a wild claim, one that should have gotten her dismissed as mad. Instead, it got her an audience with the future King Charles VII. The court tested her. Clergy grilled her for weeks, but somehow she passed. They saw something in her conviction, charisma, something unexplainable. And so, clad in white armor, her banner flying high, Joan was sent to Orleans, a besieged city that symbolized the war's turning point. French commanders were skeptical, but Joan's mere presence revitalized their spirit. She didn't just stand on the sidelines, she led charges, braved arrows, and rallied troops under fire. Against all odds, the French lifted the siege. The victory electrified the nation. Joan became known as the Maid of Orleans, a symbol of divine favor and patriotic resistance. After a string of victories, she escorted Charles to Rheims, where he was crowned king, just as the voices had foretold. But power, fame, and miracles come with enemies. In 1430, she was captured by Burgundian allies of the English. Tried by a pro-English ecclesiastical court, Joan was accused of heresy, witchcraft, and notably wearing male clothing, a crime punishable by death. She was just 19 when they burned her alive in Rouen marketplace, but her death only magnified her legend. Years later, the church reversed her conviction centuries later. She was canonized as a saint. By the time Nakano Takiko took up her naginata, a bladed polearm favored by samurai women, Japan was changing fast. It was the late 1860s, and the samurai class was being dismantled as the country modernized. But in one final stand for the old ways, this young woman would write herself into history as the last true Onaba geisha, female warrior of the samurai tradition. Nakano was born in 1847 into a respected family of scholars and warriors. From a young age, she studied Confucian classics, calligraphy, and most importantly, martial arts. Her favored weapon, the naginata, was more than just practical. It was symbolic. Traditionally used by women of the samurai class, it allowed for extended reach and graceful, fluid combat under the guidance of her adoptive father and martial arts master. She trained until her skill rivaled that of the best men in her domain. By her 20s, Nakano had become both an educator and a warrior, teaching other women the ways of the sword. But in 1868, when the Boshin War broke out, a civil conflict between the imperial forces and the old Tokugawa shogunate, Nakano didn't stay behind. She joined the defense of Aizu, one of the last bastions of traditional samurai resistance. Women were not officially allowed to serve, but Nakano formed an unofficial unit of female fighters known as the Joshitai, the women's army. Clad in hakama pants and traditional armor, these women fought fiercely alongside the men, protecting their families, their city, and their way of life. At the Battle of Aizu, Nakano led her unit in hand-to-hand combat against imperial troops armed with rifles. According to witnesses, she killed several enemies before being shot in the chest. Knowing she was mortally wounded and unwilling to be captured or defiled, she asked her sister to behead her. Her body was buried at a temple in Fukushima, her sword beside her. Nakano's bravery was legendary, even in defeat. Today, statues of her stand in Japan, particularly in Aizu, where she's remembered not only as a warrior, but as a woman who refused to bow to modernity, to patriarchy, or to death itself. In the smoldering ruins of World War II, one name sent shivers down the spines of German soldiers on the Eastern Front, Lyudmila Pavlichenko. Nicknamed Lady Death by her enemies, she wasn't a myth, a morale booster, or a propaganda figure. She was the real thing. A Soviet sniper who tallied 309 confirmed kills, including 36 enemy snipers. She was the most lethal female sniper in recorded history. Born in 1916 in what is now Ukraine, Pavlichenko was competitive from a young age. She was fiercely patriotic and a natural marksman. When Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, she was just 24 years old and studying history at university. But instead of books, she picked up a rifle and volunteered for the Red Army. Officials initially suggested she become a nurse. She refused. She wanted a combat role. And she got one. Deployed to the front lines during the siege of Odessa and later the siege of Sevastopol, Pavlichenko earned her reputation the hard way. She spent long hours motionless, camouflaged in freezing terrain, waiting for the perfect shot. Her targets weren't just foot soldiers. She hunted officers, machine gunners, and rival snipers. She operated with nerves of steel, patience bordering on the supernatural, and an absolute hatred for the invaders. Her kill count climbed so high she was pulled from the front and sent on a diplomatic tour of the United States, Canada, and the UK. There she met President Franklin D. Roosevelt and formed a friendship with Eleanor Roosevelt, who admired her composure and intellect. Pavlichenko gave speeches urging the Allies to open a second front in Europe and mocking reporters who asked her sexist questions about makeup and skirt length. After the war, she didn't retreat into obscurity. She earned her degree, became a historian, and trained future generations of Soviet snipers. Though she suffered from war-related trauma and injuries, her legacy endured. She received the Hero of the Soviet Union medal and remains a national hero in both Russia and Ukraine. In a world that often doubts the place of women in war, Lyudmila Pavlichenko didn't argue. She didn't protest. She simply did the job better than almost anyone who ever lived. For every famous name, Boudica, Tomoygazin, Lyudmila Pavlichenko, there are countless others whose stories have slipped through the cracks of mainstream history. History, after all, was largely written by men, and when women picked up swords, rifles, or spears, they were often omitted, downplayed, or turned into myth. But make no mistake, warrior women have been there all along, across continent, across centuries, and their silence was not voluntary. Consider the Trung sisters of Vietnam, Trung Trac and Trung Ani, who led a rebellion against Chinese occupation in the 1st century CE. They rode elephants into battle, rallied thousands of followers, and ruled an independent state for 3 years before being crushed by superior Chinese forces. Their resistance is still commemorated today, with temples and festivals in their honor, even though global history books rarely mention them. Or the Yas Sanawa of the Ashanti Empire in West Africa, who in 1900 led a rebellion against British colonial forces. As Queen Mother, she rallied her people when the British demanded the sacred golden stool, the symbol of Ashanti sovereignty. She delivered fiery speeches and led her troops in battle, showing that leadership and defiance knew no gender. There were Viking shield maidens, likely not as common as legend suggests, but very much present. Archaeological finds confirm that women were buried with weapons, armor, and even war horses, not as ceremonial tokens, but as warriors. There were Apache women fighters in the American Southwest, like Lozin, a spiritual warrior who rode and fought beside her brother, the famous leader Victorio. In every era, in every region, warrior women fought not always to conquer, but to protect, to defend their families, their cultures, their homes. Some led armies. Others fought as lone figures in resistance movements. Some were queens, some were peasants, but all shattered the lie that war belonged to men alone. Today, their legacy is being reclaimed, from scholarly research to pop culture representations. The stories of these women are finally resurfacing, and each rediscovered name is a reminder. History is not just what was written, it's also what was erased. These women didn't ask to be remembered, they asked to be respected, and slowly the world is beginning to listen. In the heart of ancient Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, music wasn't just entertainment, it was ritual power. And language. And no instrument embodied this more than the lyre. Among the world's earliest stringed instruments, the Mesopotamian lyre dates back over 4,500 years, emerging from the Sumerian city of Ur, where music was woven into both temple ceremony and royal court life. The lyres of Ur weren't simple harps carved from wood. They were intricate, beautifully crafted objects, often adorned with gold, silver, lapis lazuli, and detailed animal motifs. One of the most famous examples is the bull-headed lyre, discovered in a royal tomb in the 1920s by Sir Leonard Woolley. Its soundbox was shaped like a bull's body, and the instrument head was covered in gold leaf, its beard made of lapis. But this wasn't just for show. The bull was a symbol of strength, and its presence on a lyre may have been spiritual, not decorative. Played with the fingers or a small plectrum, the lyre produced a resonant, haunting tone. Though we can't hear ancient melodies exactly as they were, scholars believe the Sumerians used a heptatonic scale, 7 notes, much like modern Western music. Clay tablets inscribed with early musical notation provide tantalizing clues, showing that music theory and scale construction existed even then. These lyres weren't confined to palace halls. In temples, music accompanied offerings and prayers to the gods. Hymns were sung with lyre accompaniment in honor of deities like Inanna and Enlil, turning music into a sacred bridge between human and divine. In funerary rites, lyres mourned the dead, helping guide souls into the afterlife. They weren't just instruments, they were voices of transition and transformation. Mesopotamian musicians held a respected role in society. Some were female priestesses, others were court performers. They memorized complex songs passed down orally, often learning from a young age within structured schools for scribes and musicians. Today, replicas of these ancient lyres are played in museums and reconstructions, their soft, twanging echoes reminding us that long before Mozart, before medieval minstrels, or even Homer sung epics, humans were plucking strings in the desert, chasing beauty and sound. While the lyres sang gently to the gods, the aulos screamed, wept and danced through the hearts of the ancient Greeks. This reed-blown, double-piped wind instrument was no gentle flute. It was wild, emotional, and unrelenting. To the Greeks, music wasn't just entertainment. It was ethos, a force that shaped the soul. And the aulos embodied its most primal edge. Unlike the lyre, which symbolized harmony and order favored by Apollo, the aulos was associated with Dionysus, god of wine, ecstasy, and madness. It was often played during rituals, dramatic performances, and military marches, giving it a range of emotional and functional uses. It consisted of 2 pipes, usually made of wood, bone, or ivory. Each with its own reed and fingering holes, the musician, or orlet, played both pipes simultaneously, producing a dense, penetrating sound closer to a bagpipe than a modern flute. This required incredible breath control. Musicians often used a technique called circular breathing, inhaling through the nose while pushing air out through the cheeks, allowing them to play continuously. The effort warped their faces and puffed their cheeks, so much so that athletes sometimes mocked aulet players for their awkward appearance. Yet despite the jokes, aulet players were respected, even revered in certain circles. The orlos were not for calm background music. It stirred the blood. In ancient Greek theater, It accompanied tragedies and comedies, adding mood and momentum to performances by Sophocles and Euripides. In battle, it kept hoplites marching in step, its blaring voice slicing through the chaos, and during baksheik rituals it pushed dancers into trance-like states, dissolving the line between performer and possessed. Plato had a complicated relationship with the aulos. In his Republic, he famously dismissed it as too emotionally overwhelming, preferring instruments like the lyre and cathara for their intellectual clarity. Yet even he couldn't deny its power. The aulos could simulate sorrow, mimic fury, or stir euphoria, sometimes all in the same breath. Today, fragments of ancient orloi survive in museums, and modern reconstructions hint at its raw energy. Unlike the mathematically balanced lyre, the aulos wasn't about perfection. It was about release. It carried the sound of frenzy, mourning, seduction, and war. In the ancient courts and scholars' studios of China, music was more than art. It was philosophy in motion, and few instruments embody this more than the guqin and the guzheng, two-string zither that carried the sounds of dynasties, meditation, and poetic introspection. They may look similar at a glance, but each served a distinct role in shaping China's musical identity. The guqin is the elder of the two, an instrument with over 3,000 years of history. With 7 strings and a long, fretless wooden body, it produced quiet, subtle tones. To the untrained ear, the guqin sounds almost whisper-like. Gentle slides, harmonics, and plucked notes that echo like raindrops on old tile. But to Chinese scholars and sages, these sounds reflected the balance between heaven and earth. Confucius himself was said to play the guqin, believing it cultivated moral character and inner harmony. In ancient China, learning to play the guqin wasn't about becoming a performer. It was about becoming civilized. Contrast this with the guzheng, a younger, louder cousin with a brighter sound and more public life, with 16 to 21 strings or more in modern versions. The guzheng was built for performance. Its curved wooden frame and movable bridges allow for rich melodies and dramatic glissandos. Musicians pluck the strings with plectra attached to their fingers, creating cascades of notes that shimmer like flowing water. It was favored in palaces, folk music, and even military camps. Where the guqin whispered to the soul, the guzheng sang to the crowd. Both instruments had roles in ritual and storytelling. The guqin often accompanied poetry readings, philosophical lectures, and meditation. The guzheng was used in banquets, operas, and to recount historical epics. Its music could mimic galloping horses, flowing rivers, or weeping lovers, all through vibrating silk strings and masterful fingerwork. These instruments also represented gendered spaces in ancient China. The guqin was traditionally played by male scholars, while the guzheng became more associated with female performers, especially in later dynasties. Yet both were respected, taught in musical academies, and written into the Confucian ideals of balanced education. Today, both guqin and guzheng are still played, revived in classical and contemporary settings alike. They remain living echoes of China's ancient soul, where music was not only heard, but felt as a path to virtue and emotional depth. In ancient Egypt, music wasn't background noise. It was a sacred tool, a form of divine communication that echoed through temples, tombs, and daily life. From pharaohs to peasants, music was everywhere. It soothed laborers, honored the dead, guided religious rituals, and entertained the living. And the instruments that shaped this soundscape were as diverse as the Nile itself. One of the oldest and most iconic Egyptian instruments was the harp. Early harps, curved like bows, evolved into larger angular harps that stood as tall as a man. These instruments were plucked with the fingers, often by temple musicians or court entertainers. Harps weren't just for art, they were associated with the afterlife. Tomb paintings often show harpists playing for the souls of the dead, easing their journey into eternity. Then came the sistrum, a sacred rattle associated with the goddess Hathor, protector of music, motherhood, and joy. Made of metal with loose crossbars, the sistrum produced a jangling sound when shaken. It wasn't subtle, but it was powerful, used in temples to summon gods, purify spaces, and drive out evil spirits. The shaking of a sistrum was believed to please deities and maintain cosmic order. Flutes, often made from reed or bone, added breathy melodies to processions and rituals. The double clarinet, with two pipes played simultaneously, created a rich, buzzing harmony, a predecessor of the aulos of Greece. Percussion came through frame drums, hand clappers, and even castanets, especially in dances and festivals. Professional musicians in Egypt held respected positions. Many were women, depicted in art as harpists and singers often serving temples. These women were more than entertainers. They were chantresses of Ammonius, musicians of Isis, figures of spiritual power. Music could honor gods, accompany offerings, and mark the transition between life and death. Egyptian notation remains elusive. Unlike Mesopotamia or Greece, few musical records survive, but their instruments, depicted vividly in tombs and temples, tell us enough. Ancient Egyptians understood music as structure, emotion, and magic. Even in death, music was essential. Instruments were buried with the elite, their owners believing they'd play again in the field of reeds, the Egyptian paradise. To them, music wasn't a pastime. It was eternity's language, long before written words etched history into stone. Ancient African cultures used something far more primal and immediate: rhythm. Across the continent, drums weren't just instruments, they were voices. They spoke, commanded, remembered, and summoned. In Africa's ancient societies, music, especially percussion, was a living, breathing language that carried stories, laws, identities, and the pulse of the divine. Drums varied by region and purpose, but one of the most iconic was the talking drum found in West Africa. Shaped like an hourglass and strung with leather cords, this drum could mimic the tonal language of the people. Skilled drummers could speak entire phrases by adjusting tension on the cords while striking it with a curved stick. Messages were sent across villages announcing births, deaths, warnings, or royal summons long before the invention of paper or the postal system. The drum became the continent's first wireless communication system. But drums weren't just practical, they were spiritual. In kingdoms like ancient Kush and Nok, drums summoned ancestors and deities. In Ife and Benin, they honored kings and gods in elaborate court rituals. Drumming was central to initiation ceremonies, healing rituals, and funerals. It was said that to beat a sacred drum was to awaken forces beyond the veil. African drums came in countless forms: djem, dun-dun, bugarabu, and kiti, each with specific roles in a musical hierarchy. They were carved from single logs, carefully hollowed and fitted with animal hide, each tuned to a specific pitch or tone. The craftsmanship was sacred, passed down from father to son with rituals even during the making of the instrument, and percussion didn't stop at drums. Rattles, bells, shakers, and thumb pianos added layers of rhythm and melody, creating a complex, polyrhythmic soundscape that Western music wouldn't fully understand until centuries later. In African tradition, music was inseparable from movement. You didn't just listen. You danced, breathed, sweated with it. The drummer wasn't a performer. He was a conduit, channeling energy, spirit, and communal memory. These rhythms traveled through the trans-Saharan trade, through the Nile, and later through the Atlantic slave trade, shaping diasporic music from Brazil to the Caribbean. But their heart was always Africa, where the beat wasn't entertainment. It was identity, ancestry, and survival. High in the Andean mountains, where the air thins and the clouds brush the earth, music floated through the stone cities and terraced fields, not from string or drum, but from wind. Ancient Andean civilizations like the Nazca, Moche, and Inca developed a rich musical tradition centered around aerophones, flutes, whistles, and most famously panpipes or siku. The siku is a deceptively simple-looking instrument, multiple reeds or bamboo tubes of varying lengths lashed together in a row or stacked in double rows. Each tube plays one note, and players alternate rapidly between rows to create melodies. The result is a haunting, breathy harmony that echoes across mountains like a conversation with the wind itself. Siku ensembles were often played in pairs, two players performing alternating notes in interlocking patterns, a technique called hocketing, which symbolized the Andean ideal of duality and balance in nature and society. Flutes made of bone, clay, or reed were also widespread, some so small they could hang from necklaces, others large enough to produce deep resonant tones. Many were carved in the shapes of birds, snakes, or spirits, showing the spiritual link between sound and the natural world. These weren't just musical instruments, they were sacred tools. Music was used to call rain, bless harvests, honor the sun, or communicate with ancestors. One particularly fascinating find is the ceramic whistling vessels of the Moche civilization. When water was poured into them, internal chambers forced air through a whistle, producing eerie tones, literally musical pottery. These were likely used in rituals, combining water, air, and sound into a single ceremonial act. In Inca society, music accompanied every stage of life. From birth celebrations to funerals, from military parades to agricultural festivals, there was a melody for every moment. Inca musicians played for gods like Inti, the sun, and Pachamama, the earth, offering their breath as a form of spiritual devotion. Even soldiers marched with coordinated flute music, turning warfare into ritual choreography. Though Spanish colonization nearly erased many native traditions, the sound of Andean flutes never fully vanished. Today, their echoes can still be heard in Peruvian highlands and Bolivian villages. An ancient voice of stone, wind, and sky still singing in the thin air. In ancient India, music was more than a performance. It was cosmic engineering. According to Hindu philosophy, the universe itself was created from sound, from the primordial vibration known as Om. From this belief grew one of the world's most intricate and enduring musical traditions, rooted in ritual, mathematics, and spiritual transformation. Early texts like the Vedas, dating back to at least 1500 BCE, already contain hymns known as Saman chants, which were meant to be sung, not just recited. These hymns formed part of sacred rituals with specific melodies designed to align the soul with divine forces. The priestly caste, the Brahmins, were trained not only in philosophy and fire offerings, but in voice modulation and musical cadence. Precision was essential. Mispronouncing a note could, in theory, corrupt the ritual. The earliest instruments used in Vedic and post-Vedic India served both sonic and symbolic roles. The veena, a plucked string instrument with a resonating gourd, became a symbol of learning and divine expression. It was, and still is, associated with the goddess Sarasvati, the deity of wisdom and the arts. Its strings were said to echo the vibrations of the cosmos, allowing the player to connect with universal truths through melody. Wind instruments like the Bansuri bamboo flute were not only tools of melody, but vehicles of myth. Lord Krishna, the god of love and divine play, was often depicted playing the flute, charming humans and animals alike. The sound of the bansuri was believed to pierce the illusions of reality and transport listeners to a higher state of consciousness. Percussion also held immense power. The mridangam and tabla weren't just rhythm keepers. They mirrored heartbeats, breath patterns, and cosmic cycles. Rhythms, or talas, were complex mathematical patterns, some cyclical, some asymmetrical, each linked to emotional states and times of day. Indian music was deeply tied to rasa theory, the belief that music should evoke specific emotional flavors like love, heroism, serenity, or sorrow. Even in ancient times, ragas, melodic frameworks, were designed to stir the soul and guide meditation. Unlike many ancient traditions lost to time, India's musical roots have not only survived, they've evolved. But at their core remains the same ancient belief that to make music is to touch the divine. In the ancient cities of Mesoamerica, from the towering pyramids of Teotihuacan to the ceremonial plazas of the Maya and Aztecs, music was inseparable from the sacred. It wasn't just art, it was power used to speak to gods, sanctify blood offerings, summon rain, and terrify enemies. For the peoples of Mesoamerica, music was ritual technology, an invisible thread linking humans to the divine and the dead. Drums dominated the soundscape. The most iconic was the huehuetl, a tall single-headed drum carved from hollowed tree trunks and played with bare hands. Covered in animal skins and adorned with glyphs or sacred images, the huehuetl throbbed during festivals, warfare, and sacrifices. Its deep, resonant sound echoed through stone courtyards like the heartbeat of the gods. Then came the teponazli, the slit drum made of hollowed wood played with rubber-tipped mallets. Its surface was carved into two tongues that produced different pitches when struck. The teponazli wasn't just percussive, it could speak. In Nahuatl, the Aztec language, it was said that teponazli could sing the names of deities or the rhythms of fate itself. Wind instruments were also central. Flutes made of bone, clay, and reed were common, often shaped like animals or gods. Some were so intricately made that they could mimic bird calls, jaguar growls, or human screams. In fact, the infamous Aztec death whistle, shaped like a skull and blown like a flute, produces a blood-chilling shriek, possibly used during war or sacrificial ceremonies to strike terror into enemies or open portals to the spirit world. Music accompanied every major event. Coming-of-age rites, warfare, agricultural cycles, and death. Musicians and dancers trained in special schools, performing not just for crowds, but for gods. Certain instruments were reserved for nobles or priests. Playing them incorrectly could be considered a spiritual offense. Even sacrifice, central to Aztec religion, was carried out to a musical score. Drums pounded, flutes wailed, and conch shells howled while hearts were offered to the sun. The music didn't soothe. It activated. It guided souls, fed gods, and kept the cosmic engine turning. In Mesoamerica, music wasn't a backdrop. It was the ceremony. It wasn't meant to entertain. It was meant to transform. Though the civilizations of antiquity have risen and fallen, their music has never truly died. It lingers, not always in sound, but in ritual, design, and cultural DNA. In many ways, ancient music was never meant to be preserved in sheet music or captured in recordings. It was passed through hands, mouths, and hearts, a living tradition encoded in memory and performance. Take the Chinese guqin or Indian veena. These aren't museum pieces. They're still played today, often using techniques that have been passed down for millennia. Performers don't just mimic ancient sounds, they embody them. Each note carries centuries of philosophy, culture, and meditation. In a single pluck, you can feel the same longing or joy that an emperor or sage once felt. In Africa, the drums still speak. The rhythms of the djem, the call and response of griots, the syncopation of dance, all echo ancient practices that predate colonial maps or written history. Even in the Americas, the haunting breath of the Andean siku or the thunder of powwow drums among indigenous tribes reflects echoes of ancestral voices. Some instruments are direct descendants, others are inspired reinventions, but the roots are ancient. Even in modern Western music, ancient concepts survive. The seven-note heptatonic scale used in Mesopotamia laid a foundation for modern harmony, Greek music theory modes. Intervals, ethos fed into early Christian chant, and the eventual birth of classical music and the instruments. The lyre became the lute which birthed the guitar. The Alas's double redesign inspired the oboe and bassoon. But perhaps the most enduring legacy is the purpose of ancient music. It wasn't meant to sell tickets or top charts. It was a ritual. It was healing. It marked birth and death, sowing and harvest, love and war. It meant something. Even today, music remains our universal language, able to stir emotion without words, to create community without walls. In a digital world overflowing with noise, ancient music reminds us that sound can be sacred, that rhythm can be memory and melody, a thread between worlds. Whether whispered from a guqin, shouted through a war drum, or piped from a clay flute, the songs of our ancestors still echo. We just have to listen. You open your eyes and the first thing you see is your brother's foot, inches from your face, grimy, and twitching slightly from some horrifying dream. Welcome to your one and only room. It's not a bedroom. It's not a living room. It's the room. And it's everything. You share it with 6 other souls. 1 bed, 2 chairs with questionable structural integrity, and a rat who's been around so long you're considering charging him rent. There's no wallpaper, just patches of wall where something used to be. The ceiling leaks when it rains, and even when it doesn't, it drips something that you've decided not to investigate. The fireplace is fake. The air is damp. The floor creaks like it's trying to warn you of your own mortality. You're wrapped in a thin wool blanket that hasn't been washed since the Crimean War, and the pillow under your head is made of straw, possibly mixed with someone's long-forgotten sock. There's no plumbing. That bucket in the corner, that's the toilet, bath, and emergency water source. Depending on the time of day and level of desperation, you've learned to breathe through your mouth in the mornings. It helps a bit. There's one window, if you can call it that, so covered in soot and fog, it mostly just lets in the sound of cartwheels, shouting vendors, and someone aggressively coughing 3 doors down. You try not to think about the fact that the window opens onto an alley where the butcher dumps his offcuts and your neighbor keeps his goat. Every morning begins with a family-wide shuffle. You dress under blankets to avoid the cold. You swap spots around the wash basin like it's a game of musical chairs with fewer prizes, and someone always knocks over the chamber pot. And yet somehow this room is still home. You know which floorboard creaks, which corner drips, and which window pane rattles just before your neighbor yells about his stolen boots. You know the smell of the dust, the strange sense of belonging. But make no mistake, this room isn't comfortable. It isn't cute. It's a place that prepares you for the day outside by making you suffer a little before you even leave. And trust me, the streets won't be kinder. You stumble out the front door, still blinking sleep from your eyes and clutching half a crust of bread, and immediately walk face first into a wall of choking fog. But this isn't the romantic candlelit haze they write about in novels. No, this is London's infamous peace super, and it's like trying to breathe through a coal-stuffed sock. The sky is gray, the street is gray, the air is gray. You can't see the end of your own arm, and you're pretty sure that's a lamppost ahead. Or possibly a horse. Could go either way. This fog isn't just weather, it's murderous. Formed by the happy marriage of industrial coal smoke and natural mist, it clings to everything. It seeps into your lungs, coats your throat, and gives your clothes that signature London look, soot-streaked and mildly flammable. You cough. Everyone coughs. It's part of the local soundtrack, like church bells and clattering hoofs. Children hack like lifelong smokers. Old men cough so hard they rattle windows in doctors. Well, they recommend moving to the countryside, which is great advice if you own land and your own lungs. The smell is a complex bouquet. Chimney soot, sewage vapor, horse manure, and last night's overcooked cabbage. If perfume makers bottle this, it will be called Eau de Urban Misery, and it gets into everything. Your hair, your bread, your one nice shirt you wear to funerals and job interviews. It's all stained with the scent of progress. The worst part? No one's surprised. People go about their day blindly. Literally, Steve. Lamps burn all day long and still don't help. You hear someone trip in the alley next to you, and someone else swears as their umbrella disappears into the mist like a ghost ship. At night, it gets even thicker. The fog curls through door cracks. It blankets the tenements. And if you don't keep a candle lit, you might walk straight into the fireplace, or worse, your neighbor's lap. So yes, the air in Victorian London doesn't just choke you. It brands you, smokes you, and dares you to keep breathing. And you haven't even reached the street market yet. You've made it out of bed, out of your smoke-soaked hovel, and down into the day's gray beginnings. Now your stomach groans. Time for breakfast. Except breakfast in Victorian London is less of a meal and more of a ritual and lowered expectations. If you're part of the working class, and you almost certainly are, breakfast isn't eggs or toast or a hearty pile of bacon. It's a crust of bread that could double as a roof tile. Maybe some porridge if the oats weren't eaten by the rats in the cupboard. And tea. Always tea. Not because it's comforting, but because it's boiled. And anything that's been boiled probably won't kill you. Milk. Only if you can afford it. And even then it's a gamble. It might be watered down or worse. Preserved with formaldehyde by enterprising vendors who think child safety is a loose guideline. Sugar is expensive. Butter. A legend. Jam. Only if your aunt died and left you some in her will. If you're lucky enough to work in a factory or live near a bakery, you might sniff warm bread in the air. Don't get excited. That's not your bread. That's someone else's breakfast, likely belonging to a man with a hat and a last name on his door. And if you're really down on your luck, an orphan, an out-of-work widow, just someone who lost their job to a machine, you might find yourself queuing at a workhouse for a ladle of grayish gruel. It's warm. It's edible. That's about the kindest thing one could say, Steve. Vendors might offer fried potatoes or old meat pies, but beware. The meat is unidentifiable, the oil ancient, and the odds of intestinal regret high. Still, the smell is oddly inviting. When you're starving, everything smells like hope. You eat quickly, standing, wrapped in your coat like a cloak of denial. There's no dining room, no soft morning music, just cold fog, clanging wheels, and the distant sound of someone already yelling about stolen coal. And now, belly's only half full and spirits not at all. It's time to step into the real monster, the streets of London. Welcome to the streets of Victorian London, a sprawling, chaotic organism pulsing with smoke, mud, and misery. Every step you take is a calculated risk, and the street doesn't care if you're late for work or just trying to cross the road without being trampled to death. First things first, there are no sidewalks. Or if there are, they're so narrow, cracked, and crowded that using them is a polite suggestion, not a safety guarantee. The main road is a mucky battlefield of hoofbeats, wagon wheels, and ankle-deep sludge. Horse-drawn carts barrel past at terrifying speeds. Carriages clip corners. One false move and you're face down in a puddle that smells like something died in it because something probably did. Now mind the gutters. They run down the middle of the street, carrying all the city's discarded glory, rotting vegetables, dead rats, coal ash, the contents of chamber pots dumped from upstairs windows, and the occasional shoe foot optional. Crossing them without slipping requires Olympic-level balance, or a very long stick and no dignity. But it's not just the terrain that's out to get you. It's the people, too. You got street urchins darting around like caffeinated squirrels, pickpockets brushing against your coat, accidentally, and vendors yelling about eels, kippers, or something vaguely called meat. Everyone's yelling, all the time, about everything. There are also the coppers trying to look important, while ignoring most of what's happening around them. If someone gets stabbed, they'll eventually wander over, assuming the shift hasn't ended, or they haven't been bribed to look the other way. The air is still thick with smog, now flavored with horse manure and pipe smoke. And in the distance you hear the bells of St. Paul's. Or maybe that's just your ears ringing after someone shouted in your face about chimney soot. Oh, and if it rains, which it does, often the streets turn into rivers of filth. No one offers an umbrella. No one even looks surprised. You just pull your coat tighter and trudge through it, hoping your boots don't dissolve. And this is just your commute. Survive the streets, and you might live to find a job, or at least something that pays enough to keep bread on the table and rats off your toes. You've navigated the sewers masquerading as streets, dodged horses and hooligans, and now it's time to make your living, if the city allows it. In Victorian London, a job isn't a title. It's a test of endurance, a way to slowly fall apart while clinging to the illusion of stability. If you're a man, you might be lucky enough to land work in a factory 12 to 16 hours a day, 6 days a week for wages that wouldn't feed a well-behaved cat. The noise is deafening. The air is full of soot, metal shavings, and regret. If you lose a finger in the machine, don't worry. There are 20 children lined up behind you, ready to take your spot. Don't fancy machinery. Try bricklaying or hauling coal, or working in the docks where your back gives out by 30 and your teeth fall out by 40 if you live that long. Women, you're scrubbing floors, washing other people's laundry until your hands dissolve, sewing buttons until you forget what daylight looks like. All for pennies. And when those options run out, there's always the street. No sick leave, no safety, and no sympathy. Maybe you're a chimney sweep or a mudlark, digging through the Thames at low tide, looking for scraps of rope, nails, or bones to sell. The smell is free, the dysentery also included. Or perhaps you've landed in a workhouse, that magical institution where the destitute are helped by being worked to the bone in exchange for food so bland it feels like a punishment. You're not here to thrive. You're here to not die too loudly. Jobs come and go. Illness doesn't. Injury means starvation. There's no workers' comp, no health insurance, and no HR department. Just a foreman yelling at you to lift faster, breathe quieter, and stop bleeding on the equipment. And heaven forbid you complain, there's always someone more desperate behind you, willing to work for even less. Competition is fierce and compassion is scarce. So yes, you're employed, but don't get too excited. In Victorian London, a job doesn't pull you out of poverty. It just gives you something to do while you're in it. In Victorian London, Childhood isn't a time of innocence. It's a short window before your back gives out and your lungs fill with soot. If you're small enough to fit inside a chimney, congratulations, you're considered employable. Forget toys and bedtime stories. By the time you're 5, you're already working. 6 if your parents are merciful. School is a luxury. Work is your future and your present. You might be a chimney sweep, crawling through narrow flues, scraping out soot while praying you don't get stuck. If you scream, they'll poke you with a stick. If you stop moving, they'll assume the worst and keep going. Or perhaps you're a match girl, dipping wooden sticks into white phosphorus that poisons your jawbone until it glows in the dark and eventually falls off. The pay? Few pence. The hazard? Bone death. A charming trade-off. Some children are mudlarks, scavenging through the toxic sludge of the Thames at low tide, looking for nails, rope, anything remotely sellable. You emerge soaked, freezing, and likely infected with something Victorian science hasn't even named yet. Others hawk newspapers on the street, shout about roasted chestnuts they can't afford, or run messages for pennies. You run fast, dodge traffic, and hope today isn't the day you're trampled by a horse or beaten for looking the wrong way at the wrong man. Factory work. That's the dream. Indoors. Steady hours. Just ignore the amputations. Children clean under whirring machines, often while they're still running. You learn fast or you lose a hand. No safety gear. No days off, no sympathy. Just sweat, noise, and an ever-present adult barking orders. And if you're an orphan, the world doesn't owe you anything. Workhouses, the street, or worse. Some are sold into service. Others vanish, absorbed into the fog, a footnote in someone else's story. In the eyes of Victorian industry, children are cheap, obedient, and disposable. Childhood isn't stolen, it's simply never offered. And yet, somehow they survive. They play with scraps, sing songs in alleys, and laugh between shifts, between coughs. Because they have to. Because in London, even children are expected to carry the weight of empire on their tiny, soot-covered shoulders. If you thought surviving Victorian London was hard as a man, try doing it as a woman. You work all the time. And no, you don't get applause or medals. You get calluses, exhaustion, and a society that expects you to smile while your spine collapses. If you're unmarried, you might be a domestic servant. That means scrubbing floors from dawn till dusk, hauling buckets of coal, blacking the hearth, ironing until your arms ache. And never sit down unless someone tells you to. You eat last. You sleep in the attic. And if the master gets handsy, well, you should feel grateful, apparently. Married? That's not better. It's double duty. You clean your own home, likely a single filthy room, raise children, usually several, cook with nothing, sew everything, and manage the entire household budget with 3 shillings and a prayer. And then maybe you take in laundry from richer households, boiling, scrubbing, wringing, repeating, just to buy bread. Some women become seamstresses, stitching shirts in poorly lit corners for 14 hours a day. It pays pennies. It ruins your eyesight. And if your fingers bleed on the fabric, you lose the job. And then there's the match factories where white phosphorus eats through your jaw. Quite literally. You start with a toothache and end with a rotting face. Management says it's your fault for chewing gum. When none of that pays enough, or when you're widowed, orphaned, or just unlucky, the street becomes the only option. Sex work is legal, unofficially ignored, and socially condemned. You might make enough for food and rent, or you might get arrested, attacked, or worse. Protection? Only if you count wool gloves and luck. Women in Victorian London are expected to be quiet, clean, obedient, and always busy. You're the moral center of the home. Even if the home has no floorboards, no heat, and no future, there are no rights, no maternity leave, no safety net. Just other women, sometimes kind, sometimes cruel, trying to survive the same nightmare. But somehow they do, with grim determination, whispered jokes, and backs bent by centuries of unpaid labor. And still, they find time to comfort their children and sweep the doorstep because someone has to. You might have dodged the horses, survived the soot, and even landed a job. But in Victorian London, you can't dodge disease. It's everywhere, lurking in the water, the walls, there, and quite possibly in the meat pie you ate for lunch. Illness doesn't knock. It sits beside you on the tram, sleeps beside you in your tenement, and sneaks into your lungs while you wait in line for bread. Let's start with the basics. Tuberculosis, or consumption as they called it, because it slowly consumes your lungs, your body, and your will to live. The cough is deep, constant, and comes with blood. Everyone knows someone who has it. Most people just keep working until they drop. Then there's cholera, which arrives through your drinking water. Like a particularly cruel surprise. One minute you feel fine, the next you're vomiting, dehydrated, and desperately trying not to soil yourself in public. It spreads fast. Whole streets go silent. The local pump is chained up too late. By then, the damage is done. Typhoid, scarlet fever, diphtheria, all regular visitors. Each has its own personality, but they all share one thing in common. They hit the poor the hardest. If you can't afford a doctor, and you can't, you're left with herbal remedies, homemade poultices, or the magical healing properties of hope. Of course, there's always laudanum, a beloved mixture of alcohol and opium sold over the counter. You've got a fever. Take laudanum. Cramps? Laudanum. Grieving the death of your 8th child? Double dose. You'll still die, but you'll die very relaxed. And what about the doctors? Well, they mean well sometimes, but medicine is still guessing with Latin. Leeches are still in fashion. Surgery is done without gloves. Antiseptics are a twinkle in Lister's eye. Your odds with a street barber aren't much worse. Disease doesn't discriminate, but your living conditions help it choose you faster. No sanitation, no ventilation, 10 people in a room. It's a perfect breeding ground for microbes, misery, and mold. In Victorian London, if something doesn't kill you fast, it will kill you slowly. And if you're somehow still upright, time to refill your water. You're sweating through your soot-stained shirt, your lips are dry, and your throat feels like it's been sandpapered by coal dust. Time for a drink? Sure. But in Victorian London, water isn't your friend. It's a loaded pistol with a porcelain handle. Let's start with the Thames, the lifeblood of the city. It's also the toilet, the industrial dump, the animal graveyard, and just for good measure, the city's main drinking water source. Imagine a stew of rotting vegetables, chemical runoff, dead dogs, human waste, and expired fish flowing right past Westminster. Now pour a cup and say cheers. Don't worry, the water company says it's filtered. That means it's passed through a mesh of gravel, wishful thinking, and possibly someone's old boot. If you live in a working-class neighborhood, your tap might come from a public pump down the street, which you share with 200 neighbors and 3 nearby factories. And the worst part? You might not even know it's deadly until it's too late. Cholera loves bad water. So does typhoid. They swim freely through the pipes like microscopic sharks. Whole families are taken out within days. A shared bucket, a misused chamber pot, a splash from the wrong pump, and your headline material if you're lucky. Bathing. Now that's adorable. Most people don't have bathtubs. If you're middle class, you might share one with a family once a week. If you're poor, it's a tin tub in the kitchen once a month, if that. And that same water might double as laundry rinse, dishwater, or a place to soak your aching feet. Hygiene is creative. The government started installing sewers eventually, thanks to the Great Stink of 1858, when the smell from the Thames was so horrific that Parliament fled the building. It took a stench to make change. Until then, you boil your water when you can, or drink beer, the safe Victorian beverage for children and adults alike, weak, warm, and slightly fizzy with salvation. So yes, in Victorian London, you can die from a glass of water. The trick isn't just avoiding thirst. It's avoiding where the thirst takes you. I've tried honest work. It's long, filthy, and barely pays enough to buy yesterday's bread. The water might kill you, the factory definitely will, and the rent collector doesn't take OUs. So what's left? Crime. And in Victorian London, it's not just an act, it's a career path. Start small. Maybe you're a pickpocket or a dipper, as the slang goes. You blend into crowds near the markets, bumping into someone gently, and vanish with a pocket watch or coin purse. Charles Dickens made Oliver Twist famous, but the real-life versions didn't get musical numbers. They got sent to Newgate Prison or shipped off to Australia. If you're a woman, you might become a fence, buying and reselling stolen goods in back alleys under layers of shawls and misdirection. Or maybe you run a twilight house where pickpockets drop their loot before the bobbies come sniffing, feeling bold. Become a costermonger swindler, selling bruised fruit or watered-down milk from a rickety cart, disappearing before complaints catch up. Or try your hand at forgery, card tricks, or the always popular three-card Monty, a fast-talking scam with a faster getaway. And if you've really got guts, there's always burglary. Break into a warehouse, a merchant shop, or if you're desperate, a church. You might find something valuable. You might also find a constable with a billy club and no bedtime. The police force exists, but they're underpaid, undermanned, and often 2 steps behind. Plus, you can bribe the right officer if you know the system. And let's face it, you probably do. Crime syndicates in London were shockingly organized. Some had territories, code words, and full recruitment pipelines. Then there's the resurrection men, body snatchers who dig up fresh graves to sell corpses to medical schools. It's gruesome. It's illegal. It pays better than sewing buttons. Of course, the consequences are real. Get caught and you could be flogged, branded, jailed, or worse, transported to a penal colony. But if the alternative is starving on a cold ST, well, risk has a certain appeal. Because in Victorian London, morality comes second to hunger. Crime isn't the opposite of work. It is work. And for many, it's the only job that hires. Let's say you've caught something. Cough, a fever. Maybe your leg's been run over by a delivery cart. Time to see a doctor. Good luck. Because in Victorian London, medicine is less healing science and more creative improvisation with sharp metal. Doctors are out there, sure. Some even wear coats. But unless you're wealthy, your first stop isn't a physician, it's a chemist, where the cure for every ailment is a small bottle of laudanum. Opium in liquid form. Ideal for anything from a sore throat to existential dread. It won't cure you, but you'll stop caring. Can't afford a chemist? Maybe there's a barber surgeon down the road. Yes, a man who cuts hair and also amputates legs. If your wound is infected, he'll see it off. No anesthesia, no antiseptic, just a stick to bite. And a bucket to scream into. And don't even think about hospitals. They're overcrowded, poorly ventilated, and smell like old bandages and lost hope. The instruments aren't sterilized. Surgeons wipe their hands on aprons between patients. Germ theory exists, but many still think disease is caused by bad air and moral failure. If you survive the treatment, infection may finish the job. A splinter can become a death sentence. A toothache, that's 2 days from sepsis and childbirth. Well, women go in with pain and come out with a baby or a gravestone, sometimes both. Medical textbooks are filled with confidence and wrong guesses. You might be prescribed bleeding, muster plasters, or a mild electrocution to stimulate the humors. They balance the body by draining it, mostly of blood, money, and hope. There are a few progressive doctors with new ideas. Cleanliness, hand washing, maybe even antiseptics. But they're usually mocked by their peers. After all, how dare anyone imply that a gentleman doctor's hands carry germs? So what do most people do when sick? They wait. They sip herbal tea. They light a candle and lie very still. Because every treatment carries a risk, and recovery often feels more accidental than intentional. You don't go to the doctor to get better. You go because you've run out of other options, and sometimes, just sometimes, you come back out alive. The sun sets, the gas lamps flicker to life, and the fog thickens like a shroud. You might think the city calms down at night, but this is Victorian London. When the light fades, the real dangers come out. Forget cozy firesides and quiet evenings. The streets belong to shadows, and they're not empty. The gaslight barely cuts through the mist. Everything is a silhouette. A hunched figure in the alley, a cloaked shape behind a lamppost, footsteps that echo one beat too many. If you're out alone, you're either lost or you've run out of better options. The police patrol in pairs, swinging their truncheons and trying to look menacing. But even the constables know certain alleys are best left alone. Criminals own the night, and most wear shoes softer than copper boots. Robbers, cutthroats, and pickpockets thrive after dark. And if your route takes you through Whitechapel or Limehouse, you hold your breath and walk faster. Not because of ghosts, though the fog does play tricks, but because someone might be watching. And in 1888, he might have a knife. If you're a woman, the danger triples. Men leer from corners. Offers are whispered. Some follow. Others don't bother whispering. The darkness hides everything. Faces, screams, and sometimes bodies. Even if you stay indoors, you're not always safe. Tenement buildings creak and groan. Rats scratch behind walls. Arguments erupt 2 floors down and end with breaking glass or breaking bones. Sometimes someone vanishes and no one asks why. And let's not forget the fires. Chimneys spark, stoves tip. A knocked-over oil lamp ignites a sleeping mat. No smoke alarms, no fire brigade that arrives in minutes. Just neighbors shouting and throwing buckets into a blaze they can't control. If you must venture out, you carry a candle or a lantern and hope the flame doesn't blow out in the wind. Or worse, draw attention. Because in Victorian London, night isn't a rest, it's a risk. The poor don't sleep peacefully. They sleep light, one eye open, one ear tuned to the creak of stairs. And for many, morning is just something to survive on. The morning arrives, or at least you assume it does. Because in Victorian London, light isn't so much seen as guessed it through the thick, suffocating smog. It rolls in like a living thing, a gray, greasy mist made of coal smoke, fog, chimney ash, and the weary sighs of 1,000 overworked boilers. It wraps around buildings, slinks into cracks, and settles in your lungs like a squatter who refuses to leave. You cough again. You never really stopped. The smog irritates your throat, clings to your skin, and makes your eyelashes feel sticky. Everyone coughs. It's part of the daily soundtrack, along with the church bells, the clip-clop of hooves, and someone yelling about turnips. You wipe the windows. The cloth comes away black. You wash your hands. The water turns gray. Your clothes, no matter how often they're scrubbed, always smell faintly of smoke and despair. Even your curtains are stained with soot. They hang heavy and stiff, like they've seen too much. You think about opening the window. Then you remember what's outside. More smoke, more filth, and the smell of 12 chimney fires fighting for dominance. The worst of it, this is normal. Londoners live in a permanent twilight. The sun is a rumor. People squint to read. Children grow pale. Plants on windowsills die of asphyxiation and don't even think about drying laundry outside unless you enjoy wearing soot-stained shirts with a hint of arsenic. During the infamous Great Smogs, the air becomes so dense that you can't see your own feet. People get lost walking home. Omnibuses crash. Boats collide on the Thames. In 1873, one fog lasted for 5 straight days and left over 270 people dead. The city barely noticed. The poor, of course, get it worse. Their fires burn cheap, dirty coal. Their walls are thin, their lungs weaker. Children wheeze through winter like old dogs. If you reach adulthood without bronchitis, consumption, or mysterious blackened phlegm, you're a miracle. And yet you go on. You light the stove. You step outside. You pretend not to taste air. Because in Victorian London, the smog never ends. It just waits for you. You'd be forgiven for thinking Victorian London was all soot, sickness, and screaming. And mostly you'd be right. But even in the dirtiest corners, under the weight of poverty and fog, something human still flickers. Because kindness, oddly enough, survives here too, though you often have to squint to see it. You might spot it in the shared loaf of bread passed quietly between neighbors when one family runs out before payday, or in the woman who gives her last penny to a barefoot child with bloody feet. There's no reward, just a nod, and maybe a smile, rare and precious, even in the darkest places, the tenements, the alleys, the workhouses. People look out for each other. Not always, not perfectly, but often enough to prove that the city hasn't broken them completely. A mother shares her hot brick on a freezing night. A chimney sweep helps a new boy not get stuck on his first climb. A dying man gives his boots to someone who still has the strength to work. These aren't grand gestures. They're small, quiet, but they matter more than gold in a place where hope is a ration luxury. The pubs help too. They're loud, smelly, overcrowded, and absolutely essential. It's where people gather to sing, to joke, to drink away their bruises and their sorrow. You might not afford meat, but you can share a laugh over watery ale. Even the street performers, the penny dreadful sellers, the blind fiddler at the corner, they all form a kind of patchwork comfort, reminders that not everything in the city is out to hurt you. Kindness here isn't naive. It's practical. It's born of shared suffering. Because when the system forgets you, when the rich pretend you don't exist, your only safety net is each other. And so, despite everything, the filth, the fever, the fog, people still love, still marry, still raise children, still hope. Because if you can find kindness in the gutter, a warm hand in the cold, a crust of bread, a half-hummed lullaby, then maybe the city hasn't one. Not yet. So after 14 chapters of choking smog, rats in the walls, toxic water, and toothless chemists prescribing opium for a broken leg, ask yourself honestly, would you survive Victorian London? Probably not. Let's be clear. This wasn't a city built for comfort. It was built on coal, sweat, and the crushed spines of the working poor. Every day was a battle. Against hunger, against disease, against landlords, factory foremen, constables, and the constant creeping sense that the world had forgotten you. Modern luxuries, soap, antibiotics, light switches didn't exist. There were no social safety nets, no universal health care, no days off. Just another fog-choked morning where your goal was simple. Don't die before supper. You'd miss things like toilets, toothpaste, tap water that doesn't try to kill you. You'd wonder why everyone stares at you for brushing your teeth or asking about vegetables. You'd miss showers. Oh, you'd miss showers so much. And yet people did survive. Somehow they endured. Not because they were superhuman, but because they had no other choice. They formed unions. They raised families. They organized strikes, wrote novels, played music on street corners, and clung to hope like it was the last piece of bread in the pantry. They laughed. Yes, even in the fog. They found love in crowded slums, sang lullabies over screaming children, and danced in pubs after 16-hour shifts. They weren't just victims. They were tough, resilient, and painfully human. You probably wouldn't last a day, and that's not an insult. It's a reminder. The people who did carried the weight of an empire on their backs, often barefoot, often hungry, and almost always ignored. They built the world we now complain about in heated rooms with clean drinking water. So maybe it's okay that we wouldn't make it, but let's at least remember them. Not as soot-covered statistics, but as people who survive the impossible every single day. Gorgo was born into a city that didn't just break the rules. It redefined them. Sparta, unlike the rest of Greece, wasn't known for golden temples or philosophical debates. It was known for warriors in Gorgo. She was born right at the top of that brutal food chain, the daughter of King Cleomenes I, one of the two ruling kings of Sparta. From the moment she took her first breath, Gorgo's life was already political. She wasn't some ornament to be married off for alliances. In Sparta, women could own land, speak in public, and be educated, a fact that shocked other Greeks. And Gorgo wasn't just any Spartan woman. As the king's only child, she was expected to observe, learn, and one day wield influence in a world dominated by hoplite shields and sharp spears. As a young girl, she likely witnessed royal councils where matters of war and diplomacy were debated with blunt urgency. And she paid attention. Her father, Cleomenes, wasn't the most stable ruler. In fact, some thought he was completely mad by the end. But he left Gorgo with an early understanding of how dangerous politics could be and how sharp the knife edge of power truly was. There's a famous story. When she was only about 8 or 9 years old, a foreign ambassador tried to bribe her father to support the Persian Empire, while the adults whispered. Young Gorgo stepped forward and boldly warned her father. "Father, you had better leave, or this stranger will corrupt you." That wasn't just precocious. It was fearless. Her father listened, and the man was thrown out of Sparta. The lesson? Gorgo had teeth, and people learned early not to underestimate them. So before she was even of marriageable age, Gorgo was already showing signs of political brilliance and steel-edged judgment. She wasn't just royalty by blood, she was royalty by behavior. And in a society that admired discipline, clarity, and brutal honesty, Gorgo thrived. Her destiny was already in motion, not as a passive queen in a gilded palace, but as a Spartan lioness ready to guard her people and, if needed, speak louder than the kings themselves. Gorgo's marriage to King Leonidas was not a tale of courtly romance or opulent weddings. This was Sparta, where practicality reigned and weakness was despised. Leonidas wasn't just any Spartan man. He was a warrior through and through, known more for his silence and scars than for charm or poetry. But Gorgo was not looking for poetry. She was looking for power and a partner. By marrying Leonidas, she became queen. But unlike queens elsewhere in Greece, Gorgo didn't fade into the background. There were no secluded women's quarters for her, no endless weaving by candlelight. Spartan queens were expected to speak, to advise, to stand beside their kings as intellectual equals, and Leonidas knew exactly who he had married. Gorgo was clever, fiercely loyal to Sparta, and utterly unafraid to speak her mind, even to him. Their partnership was built on mutual respect. In the famously terse style of their people, they likely spoke few words, but every word counted. Gorgo, raised in the fire of politics since childhood, likely advised Leonidas on diplomatic tensions, Persian threats, and internal Spartan rivalries. While other Greek women were hidden from public life, Gorgo helped shape Spartan policy from within the palace walls and beyond. One of her most legendary moments came during the build-up to the Persian invasion. As tensions with Xerxes grew, Leonidas prepared to march north with his small army of 300 Spartans. Before he left, Gorgo, now a seasoned political mind, wasn't overcome with tears or begging. Instead, she offered him just 6 chilling words. Come back with your shield or on it. That wasn't just a farewell. That was an order. It was the ultimate Spartan command, reminding her husband that death in honor was preferable to life in shame. If he couldn't win, he was to die standing. And Leonidas did. At Thermopylae, he and his 300 fell to the last man, buying precious time for Greece to rally. His death would echo through history, but Gorgo's words would echo louder. She didn't just send her husband off to die. She helped forge the myth of Thermopylae itself. While Leonidas died a hero, Gorgo lived to protect the legacy, and perhaps to shape the empire his sacrifice tried to save. After Leonidas' death at Thermopylae, many queens would have slipped quietly into mourning, perhaps disappearing from the public eye. Not Gorgo. In fact, her influence only grew stronger. She had become more than just a widow. She was now the living symbol of Spartan resilience, and while statues were built for the fallen, Gorgo became a living reminder of why they fought in the first place. With Leonidas gone, Sparta was vulnerable, not just militarily, but politically. The war with Persia still raged, alliances were fragile, and tensions ran high across the Greek world. In this chaos, Gorgo acted as both guardian and strategist. Though we don't have detailed records of her day-to-day political maneuvers, several ancient sources, including Herodotus, make it clear when matters of diplomacy or internal threat arose, Gorgo was consulted. She wasn't just included, she was trusted. One story tells of a hidden message sent to the Spartans on a wooden tablet. The text had been scraped away and replaced with wax to disguise its contents, a warning about Persia's coming invasion. The men of the Spartan court were baffled, but Gorgo, calmly assessing the strange tablet, instructed them to scrape off the wax. Beneath it, the original message revealed the dire news. Gorgo had solved a diplomatic riddle that could have cost Sparta everything. Her insight likely saved thousands of lives, but Gorgo's genius wasn't just in puzzles. She understood the fragile web of alliances that held the Greek city-states together and the threat that Persian gold posed to it. While Athens and other cities were notoriously vulnerable to bribes, Gorgo's sharp warning from childhood still applied. Beware of gifts that reek of corruption. She encouraged a stance of uncompromising honor, even when it was politically risky. And the Spartans listened. Because when Gorgo spoke, it wasn't with the softness expected of women in most of the ancient world. It was with the precision of a soldier and the clarity of a strategist. She knew what was at stake, not just Sparta's land, but its very soul. Even in grief, Gorgo remained unshaken. The shield Leonidas carried into battle may have been lost, but Gorgo became something greater, the mind that would carry Sparta through its darkest days. To understand Gorgo's significance, you have to understand what it meant to be a woman in Sparta, and how Gorgo took that already rare privilege and amplified it into something nearly legendary. Spartan women were unlike any other in the ancient world. While Athenian women were confined to the home, barred from politics, and barely educated, Spartan women were trained to be physically strong, mentally sharp, and socially assertive. This wasn't just cultural flair, it was survival. Strategy Spartans believed that strong women produced strong sons, so girls ran, wrestled, and trained alongside boys in their youth. They were expected to be healthy, confident, and unafraid to speak blunt truths. But Gorgo wasn't just one of many tough Spartan women. She was the finest example of what Spartan womanhood could be. She was known not just for her wisdom, but for her razor-sharp wit. There's a famous anecdote where a foreign woman asked her, "Why are you Spartan women the only ones who rule your men?" Gorgo didn't hesitate. She shot back, "Because we are the only women who give birth to men." That line wasn't just clever. It was pure Sparta. It signaled a culture where female strength was seen as essential, not ornamental. In Gorgo's world, motherhood wasn't a passive role. It was a political one. To raise a Spartan son was to train a future warrior, and for Gorgo, raising her own son, Pleistarchus, who would become king after Leonidas, was an act of devotion, not just to family, but to the entire Spartan state. She likely oversaw his early education, surrounded him with the values of honor, sacrifice, and discipline, and instilled in him a love not for glory but for duty. Yet Gorgo never flaunted her power. She didn't need to. Her voice carried weight precisely because she used it sparingly and always with precision. She wasn't a ruler in name, but a force in reality. While Sparta remained a dual monarchy led by men, Gorgo's presence ensured there was always a keen-eyed strategist watching from behind the throne. In many ways, she was the unspoken lore of Sparta, upholding its ideals, pushing its leaders, and sharpening its spine. Gorgo didn't just redefine what it meant to be a queen. She redefined what it meant to be a Spartan. The death of Leonidas at Thermopylae was a seismic moment, not just emotionally, but politically. He had become a martyr for all of Greece, a symbol of resistance against Persian tyranny. But Sparta could not afford to weep for long. War was still raging, and the decisions made in the months that followed would determine the fate of the entire Greek world. And while Gorgo held no official rank, her influence didn't vanish with her husband's body. With her son, Pleistarchus, still a minor, a regency had to be established. While historical records don't list Gorgo as a formal regent, we can be sure she had a role in guiding his education and shaping the political decisions made in his name. This wasn't a time for grieving mothers. This was a time for cold calculation. The Persian threat was still looming, and Greece was deeply divided. Athens wanted to fight on sea, Sparta on land. Unity was fragile. It was likely during this critical period that Gorgo became something of an unofficial advisor to the Spartan Gerousia, the Council of Elders. She understood both Persian cunning and Greek pride, and more importantly, she understood how to balance Spartan honor with practical survival. Sparta could not afford to be reckless, nor could it afford to look weak. Gorgo had seen what unchecked ambition did to her father, Cleomenes, and she had learned how to walk the tightrope of power. She would have been present as Sparta debated its next steps, whether to march in again, whether to commit troops to the naval battle of Salamis, or whether to defend the Peloponnesus and let the rest of Greece fend for itself. These were not easy decisions, and they were being made by men who had just lost their king in a blaze of glory. Gorgo's presence, rational, emotionally controlled, and deeply patriotic, may have been the anchor Sparta needed. There is no record of her giving orders, but there didn't need to be. Spartan queens led through example, not decree. Her mere survival, her unshaken presence, was itself a kind of leadership. In a city obsessed with honor, Gorgo had already proven that she could carry the shield. And now, without Leonidas, she carried the memory of his sacrifice into every political decision that followed. As the war against Persia raged and the years passed, Gorgo's role subtly shifted from queen consort to queen mother, from political influencer to guardian of legacy. Yet she was never a relic of a past era. Gorgo remained a living embodiment of Spartan ideals, a presence so formidable that even without a crown or battlefield, she still commanded attention. Her son, Pleistarchus, eventually took the throne, but he was not the kind of king his father had been. Quiet, less known, and largely absent from military glory, Pleistarchus ruled in the long shadow cast by Leonidas, and behind him, still watching, was Gorgo, the woman who had raised him, shaped him, and ensured he understood what it meant to carry the blood of a hero. But what made Gorgo exceptional wasn't just her connection to two kings. It was her mind, her reputation, and the rare fact that she appears by name in multiple ancient sources, something extremely uncommon for women in classical history. Herodotus, the so-called father of history, mentions her more than once, praising her intelligence and recounting her ability to solve riddles and navigate political threats in a world where women were often nameless shadows. Gorgo stood out, not as a myth or a lover or a tragic figure, but as a mind to be reckoned with. She was, in many ways, the embodiment of what Sparta wanted to believe about itself, a society where even women were strong, wise, and ready to defend their homeland at any cost. Gorgo didn't need to fight with a spear. She fought with words, with counsel, with unwavering resolve. Her contributions weren't made on dusty battlefields, but in war councils and private conversations, in raising a king and keeping a nation emotionally intact during its darkest hours. Even centuries later, her name remains one of the few ancient Spartan women preserved by history, not because she was a queen, but because she was impossible to forget in an age when the achievements of women were easily erased. Gorgo's intellect, sharp tongue, and political bravery left a mark too deep to wash away. She didn't inherit greatness. She carved her own version of it, and Sparta, brutal and uncompromising as it was, loved her for it. Sparta prized few things: silence, strength, and discipline. But Gorgo managed to make her voice one of its sharpest weapons. She didn't speak often, but when she did, her words were remembered for centuries. She was living proof that in a culture where words were precious, the right ones could echo louder than shields clashing in battle. Gorgo was a master of Spartan wit, a form of verbal warfare all its own. She didn't use metaphors or flowery speeches. She used the truth delivered like a knife to the heart of pretense. One of her most quoted responses came when a foreign woman asked why are Spartan women the only ones who rule their men. Gorgo's reply was legendary, because we are the only women who give birth to men. The line wasn't just a jab, it was a manifesto. In 6 words, she summarized the entire Spartan worldview and female empowerment the way only a Spartan could, with blunt, blistering pride. She used language like a general uses tactics when she exposed the bribe attempt to her father as a child. She didn't stammer or plead. She issued a warning. When Persian messages came hidden in wax, she offered the solution without hesitation. Gorgo didn't just speak, she strategized through words, and Sparta listened. In a male-dominated society built around the sword, Gorgo showed that intellect could be a battlefield too. Her statements had the rhythm of command and the clarity of someone who understood power, not as ornamentation, but as responsibility. She didn't need to scream to be heard. She made every word a dagger. And what made her words so devastating was that they were always anchored in truth. She didn't bluff. She didn't flatter me. Gorgo knew exactly what was expected of her as a queen, as a Spartan, as a woman who had seen kings fall and wars ignite. She met those expectations head-on, not with emotional outbursts, but with calculated, unforgettable replies. Her voice was her weapon, her intellect was her armor. And while many queens are remembered for their tears or their beauty, Gorgo was remembered for what she said and for never saying anything she didn't mean. In Sparta, that was the highest form of respect anyone could earn. Gorgo's later years were spent in a city that never softened. Unlike other Greek polis that evolved into cultural centers, Sparta refused to compromise its militaristic identity. It remained rigid, proud, and dangerously insular. And Gorgo, still standing tall amidst its stone and bronze, witnessed the long consequences of Leonidas' sacrifice, not only for Sparta, but for Greece itself. The Persians were eventually repelled, yes, but victory came at a price. Sparta emerged from the Persian Wars with immense prestige, hailed as the protector of Greek freedom. But with honor came rivalry. Athens, fueled by democracy and ambition, grew in wealth and influence, slowly drifting from ally to adversary. Tensions simmered and a new storm was brewing. The Peloponnesian War. It was a conflict that would define the next generation of Spartans, including Gorgo's own son if Gorgo saw the writing on the wall. She likely recognized that Sparta's strict ideals, once its greatest strength, were now becoming limitations. While Athens adapted and innovated, Sparta remained unmoved. The same military codes that once made Sparta invincible also made it inflexible. But Gorgo, ever pragmatic, likely accepted this reality with the same steel-eyed clarity she had shown all her life. She had lived through more than one kind of war. Not just the ones with spears and arrows, but wars of diplomacy, of shifting alliances, of internal unrest. By now, Gorgo had likely become a living relic in the best sense of the word. A link to Leonidas, a symbol of what Sparta once was, and a reminder of what it might become again if it stayed true to its core without losing its mind to arrogance. No record survived describing her final days, but there's no reason to believe she met them with anything less than calm resolve. She had already done more than most women and most men of her time. She had ruled without ruling, fought without a sword, and shaped a city that didn't even allow its kings to indulge in softness. If Gorgo mourned, she did so privately. If she hoped for the future, she kept it to herself, because in Sparta, emotions were not for display. Legacy was, and hers was already secured in bronze and blood. Gorgo of Sparta didn't need marble statues or epic poems to be remembered. Her legacy was etched in something far stronger, a collective memory of a city built on discipline, honor, and defiance. Unlike other queens whose stories were wrapped in tragedy or romance, Gorgo's tale is one of sharp intellect, political savvy, and enduring pride. She stood at the intersection of two of Sparta's greatest icons, daughter of King Cleomenes, wife of King Leonidas, and yet she was never overshadowed by either. She wasn't a footnote in their stories. She was a chapter all her own. Historians and scholars still marvel at how frequently her name appears in the writings of Herodotus, not as a passive royal, but as a decisive figure in a world that almost never recorded the names of women. Gorgo cut through the silence like a spear through a shield. What makes her legacy even more profound is that she never held official power. She didn't command armies or sit on the throne. She advised, she warned, she solved, she raised a king. And through it all, she embodied the terrifying dignity of Sparta itself, a city that chose death over disgrace, silence over boasting, and action over rhetoric. Her most quoted words, "Come back with your shield or on it," are more than a farewell. They are a philosophy, a distilled version of the Spartan code. And though they've been repeated, repainted, and even repurposed in modern times, they still carry the cold fire of their original context, a queen sending her husband to his death, not with tears, but with a command to uphold honor today. Gorgo stands among the rare few ancient women who are remembered not because they were tragic, beautiful, or scandalous, but because they were respected. She shattered expectations in a society already notorious for doing the same. Her intellect was so pronounced, her voice so respected, that she became woven into the fabric of Sparta's identity. She may have lived over 2,000 years ago, but Gorgo remains a figure of relevance for every woman underestimated. For every strategist who works behind the scenes, for every voice that refuses to whisper, she is a timeless reminder. Strength isn't always loud, and power doesn't always wear a crown. In the heart of Jordan's sun-bleached deserts, where the horizon seems to melt into the sky and silence reigns over the sands, stand the remains of a forgotten royal ambition, the desert castles. These haunting structures, scattered across the desolate landscape, seem almost like hallucinations, grand facades rising out of the emptiness, complete with domed roofs, decorated arches, and faint traces of long-faded frescoes. They are beautiful, mysterious, and isolated, and they've puzzled historians for centuries. Built during the Umayyad Caliphate in the 7th and 8th centuries, these castles weren't built to repel armies or defend trade routes. They weren't fortresses in the traditional sense. Instead, they were luxurious retreats, seasonal residences, pleasure palaces, and hunting lodges for the Umayyad elite. Kings, princes, and high-ranking officials used these spaces as getaways from the politics of Damascus, the capital of the Islamic world at the time, and rather than hide from the harshness of the desert, they embraced it. But why build such lavish structures in such remote and unforgiving places? Part of the answer lies in the symbolism. The Umayyads were asserting control not just over land, but over nature itself. By erecting these palaces in the desert, they were sending a message. Even the harshest conditions, their power, culture, and sophistication would flourish. These buildings were monuments to Umayyad authority, artistry, and confidence. There's also a practical layer. Many of the desert castles were built near seasonal water sources or ancient trade routes, allowing them to serve as way stations or administrative hubs. Yet despite their utility, the architecture and decoration suggest something deeper. These were places of beauty and leisure. The walls once shimmered with frescoes depicting animals, musicians, and even Byzantine-style nudes. A surprising sight in early Islamic art, there were stargazing chambers, elaborate bathhouses, and audience halls with intricate carvings. Today, many of the desert castles lie in ruins, partially buried by the sand they once defied. But even in decay, they tell a story of a time when the desert was not a place to escape, but a place to transform. In these silent stones, the Umayyads left behind more than architecture. They left an echo of the empire, ambition and oasis-born luxury. To understand the desert castles of Jordan, we must step into the mindset of the Umayyads, the first great Islamic dynasty rising from the sands of Arabia to rule an empire that stretched from Spain to Central Asia. Their capital in Damascus pulsed with political power, but the Umayyads were still very much products of their tribal nomadic roots. The desert wasn't something to be avoided. It was their origin story, the crucible that had shaped their ancestors. And so, instead of leaving the wilderness behind, they brought civilization into it. The Umayyads were consolidating their rule in a rapidly expanding empire. They needed to display authority, but also legitimacy. What better way to impress local tribes and foreign envoys than with palatial retreats in the middle of nowhere? Built with cosmopolitan flair and imperial elegance, these desert estates serve as venues for diplomacy, hunting expeditions, and elite gatherings, far from the watchful eyes and political intrigue of Damascus. But these weren't crude hunting lodges. They were sophisticated, often blending Roman, Byzantine, and Persian architectural influences. The Umayyads had inherited the architectural vocabulary of the lands they conquered, and they weren't afraid to mix styles. Some of the castles feature mosaics of grapevines, fountains framed with Corinthian columns, and frescoes filled with mythical creatures. This eclectic blend of East and West sent a clear message. The Umayyads were not just desert warlords. They were heirs to a broader, multi-civilizational legacy. In places like Qasr al-Mashatta, you can still see intricate stonework adorning the outer walls, with floral and geometric designs that suggest a fusion of Islamic restraint and Greco-Roman exuberance. At Qusi el-Umra, frescoes depict bathing scenes, musicians, and even a painting of the Six Kings, an image showing rulers from Byzantium, Persia, and Ethiopia paying tribute to the Umayyads. It was visual propaganda carved in pigment and plaster. These castles weren't just about comfort, they were about image. The Umayyads understood that power needed a stage. In these desert theaters, far from the noise of the capital, they performed dominance, luxury, and cultural sophistication. They used the emptiness of the desert like a canvas, and on it they painted a vision of an empire that was both ancient and utterly new. Among all the desert castles, none captivates the imagination quite like Qasaya al-Umra. Located deep in the Jordanian desert, it looks modest from the outside. A squat structure of dusty stone half buried in the vast stillness of its surroundings. But step inside and you enter a different world. Walls alive with images, colors that defy the harshness outside, and frescoes that whisper secrets from 13 centuries ago. Built in the early 8th century, Qusr Amra is thought to have been commissioned by Caliph al-Walid Fais, or one of his princes. It served as a pleasure palace and bathhouse, part spa, part political retreat, part cultural statement. The building features a domed audience hall, several bathing rooms, and a vaulted ceiling painted with the constellations, and a Umayyad observatory hidden in the desert. But it's the frescoes that make Qusr Amra extraordinary. Covering nearly every surface, they depict a world far removed from modern assumptions about early Islamic art. There are images of dancing women, wine drinking, musicians strumming lutes, hunting scenes, and even Greek mythological figures like Hercules. The ceiling of one room shows the zodiac and personifications of the planets. Another wall features the Six Kings fresco, a powerful piece of propaganda showing rulers from distant lands seemingly bowing to the Umayyads, reinforcing the idea that the desert too was part of their dominion. This bold use of figural art has sparked debate for decades. Islamic art is often associated with aniconism, the avoidance of human and animal figures. But Qusayr Amra proves the early Islamic world was far more complex. The Umayyads weren't just building religious spaces, they were creating secular ones where luxury, astronomy, and power could mingle in visual celebration. And yet, time has taken its toll. Many frescoes are faded, their colors dulled by centuries of wind and heat, but restoration efforts have helped preserve their haunting beauty. Qusayr Amra is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, a rare glimpse into the Umayyads' intimate, hedonistic, and politically charged vision of rulership. In the middle of a dry, empty plain, Qusayr Amra still whispers courtly songs, hot baths, and starry ceilings. It is not just a building. It is a desert dream, painted in defiance of time. Qasr al-Kharana rises like a mirage from the desert plains east of Amman, a massive, symmetrical box of limestone and precision. From a distance, it looks like a military stronghold. Thick walls, narrow slits resembling arrow loops, and no visible entrance from three sides. But here's the twist. Qasr al-Kharana isn't a fortress, at least not in the traditional sense. Its secrets lie not in warfare, but in its puzzling design and uncertain purpose. Built around the early 8th century, this desert structure is one of the best preserved Umayyad castles, yet scholars remain divided over what it actually was. Despite its fortress-like appearance, there are no real defenses, no battlements, no water source, and no evidence of a standing garrison. The narrow slits may have let in light, but they wouldn't have stopped attackers. So why the armor disguise? The prevailing theory is that Qasr al-Kharna served as a caravanserai, a roadside inn for traders, travelers, and diplomats crossing the desert. Its 60 or so rooms, arranged over 2 floors around a central courtyard, could easily accommodate guests, servants, and animals. It may have also functioned as a meeting point for tribal leaders, a space for the Umayyad administration to exert influence over the Bedouin tribes who controlled the routes of the desert. Inside, the structure reveals more subtle sophistication. There are vaulted ceilings, decorative niches, and even traces of plasterwork. The second floor features rooms that may have been used for gatherings or negotiations, private enough to conduct business, but grand enough to impress. Some of the graffiti etched into the walls suggest literate guests from diverse regions, offering clues to its wide usage. Qasr al-Kharana feels like a riddle, built to look like a fortress but behaving like a salon. Its very ambiguity may have been intentional. In a time of expanding borders and political uncertainty, appearances mattered. The structure signaled strength, stability, and hospitality all at once. Today, visitors can walk through its echoing corridors, peer out through the narrow windows, and imagine what deals, arguments, and alliances once echoed within. It is a castle of shadows and subtlety, more diplomatic chessboard than battlefield. In the emptiness of the Jordanian desert, Qasr al-Kharana stands not as a monument to war, but as a stage for politics and pageantry. Qasr al-Mashhada may be ruined today, but even in its fragmented state, it dazzles with ambition. Located just south of Amman, this Umayyad palace was never fully completed, yet its unfinished bones still whisper of imperial dreams. Among all the desert castles, Qasr al-Mashhada is perhaps the most architecturally elaborate, and its surviving facade is one of the finest examples of early Islamic stonework in existence. What immediately strikes visitors and historians is the extraordinary stone relief that once adorned its southern facade. Carved with geometric patterns, floral motifs, and stylized animals, the wall is a stunning fusion of Byzantine, Sasanian, and early Islamic artistic traditions. It's a visual manifesto of the Umayyad identity, powerful, cultured, and inclusive of the civilizations it had conquered or inherited. Ironically, much of the facade isn't in Jordan anymore. In the early 20th century, the Ottoman Sultan gifted part of it to the German Kaiser. Today, the largest surviving portion resides in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, a fragment of desert glory displaced into European marble halls. But even without it, the ruins at Mashhada remain remarkable. You can still see the carefully arranged foundations, the outlines of a grand courtyard, and hints of the richly ornamented entrance hall. So what was Qasr al-Mashhada meant to be? Most scholars believe it was intended as a winter palace, not just a retreat, but a royal statement. Its scale and artistry suggest it was meant to impress visitors, perhaps foreign dignitaries or tribal allies. The palace would have featured audience halls, private quarters, courtyards, and even a mosque, all part of a self-contained oasis of power in the desert. But then, construction abruptly stopped. Some say the death of Caliph al-Walid II, who commissioned it, led to its abandonment. Others point to structural issues or shifting political priorities. Whatever the reason, Mashhad was left incomplete, its vision frozen mid-dream. And yet, the ruin still commands respect. Even unfinished, Khazar al-Mashhad tells a clear story. The Umayyads were not just warriors or rulers. They were builders of culture, masters of design, and visionaries who dared to bring luxury into the most desolate of landscapes. Mashhad may have fallen silent, but its carved stones still speak the language of empire, bold, intricate, and enduring. It might seem strange at first, elaborate bathhouses in the middle of the desert, but for the Umayyads, hammams were more than just places to wash. They were spaces of ritual, relaxation, diplomacy, and even celestial contemplation. Scattered throughout the desert castles of Jordan, these bath complexes stand as testaments to how the Umayyads brought civilization and comfort into one of Earth's most unforgiving environments. Take Qusur Amra, for example. Behind its painted walls lies a complete Roman-style bath system, a podaterium, changing room, tepidarium, warm room, caldarium, hot steam room, and a furnace system underneath to heat it all, just like the old Roman thermi. The technology wasn't new, but the intent was freshly Islamic. The Umayyads had absorbed the knowledge of their conquered territories and adapted it to their own needs in a world where water was precious. Having a functioning bathhouse was a sign of serious wealth and power. It demonstrated the caliphate's ability to manipulate nature, not just survive it. Bathing wasn't just hygienic, it was social. Here, rulers and courtiers could relax, host tribal leaders, or discuss matters of state away from the prying eyes of the court. It was intimacy wrapped in ceremony. And then there's the art. In the steam-filled walls of these hammams, we find frescoes that challenge expectations, zodiac signs, planetary figures, bathing women, musicians, hunting scenes. The ceilings in some bathhouses even resemble ancient planetariums, especially in Qusur Amra, where constellations are meticulously painted across the dome. It's as if the act of bathing was elevated into a cosmic experience, linking the physical cleansing of the body with the spiritual vastness of the heavens. This embrace of luxury wasn't decadence. It was calculated. The Umayyads weren't Puritans. They believed that showcasing their refinement was a way to legitimize their power. And in the desert, where luxury was scarce, a steaming bath was as much a political statement as a military parade. These hammams, tucked inside lonely palaces, offered not just water, but culture, places where sand gave way to steam, and where the stars above were mirrored in painted ceilings below. They remind us that even in exile from the capital, the Umayyads lived not with austerity, but with elegance and intention. One of the most mesmerizing and overlooked aspects of Jordan's desert castles is how many of them seem designed not just for comfort or politics, but for the stars in a time before telescopes and apps. The night sky was both a map and a mystery. The Umayyads, inheritors of Greco-Roman science and Persian cosmology, looked to the heavens with both spiritual reverence and intellectual curiosity, and they brought that fascination into the architecture of their desert retreats. In Qusur Amra, for example, the bathhouse dome is painted with an astrological sky. The zodiac signs, constellations, and celestial symbols circle the ceiling. In a rich blend of science and art, this is not decoration for decoration's sake. It reflects a deep understanding of astronomy, likely inherited from the scholars and scribes of the Byzantine and Persian empires. The Umayyads weren't just warriors, they were cultural sponges absorbing the best of what the ancient world had to offer. The presence of these celestial themes may have had multiple layers of meaning. On one hand, they signaled the caliphate's knowledge and sophistication. On the other, they echoed a more mystical relationship with the cosmos, the belief that power on earth was mirrored in the stars. Aligning one's rule with celestial order wasn't just good politics, it was divine symbolism. In the quiet of the desert, far from the lights of the cities, the night sky would have been overwhelming, black velvet lit with thousands of stars. The desert castles, with their open courtyards and domed chambers, were ideal observatories. Whether for calculating calendars, navigating the desert, or engaging in more esoteric practices, these sites were perfect for sky watching. The combination of isolation, silence, and celestial all must have created a setting that was as spiritual as it was scientific. It's worth remembering that early Islam was not at odds with science. In fact, the Umayyad era helped lay the groundwork for what would later become the Islamic Golden Age of astronomy. These castles, built in the middle of nowhere, were part of that intellectual lineage, not just places to bathe or rule, but to contemplate the heavens. In stone and pigment, the Umayyads carved their place between earth and sky, desert kings with their eyes on the stars. One of the most enduring mysteries surrounding the desert castles of Jordan is their sheer remoteness. Why would the Umayyads build lavish palaces, richly decorated bathhouses, and star-studded observatories so far from any major city or settlement? The answer lies not just in geography, but in psychology, politics, and performance. First, there's the practical. The early Umayyads were still rooted in their nomadic tribal past. For them, the desert was not an obstacle. It was home. The open landscape offered familiarity, privacy, and freedom. Building in the desert allowed the caliphs and their princess to retreat from the constant pressure of court life in Damascus and reconnect with their roots. These weren't outposts, they were sanctuaries. But the isolation also served a deeper purpose: symbolic domination. Constructing monumental architecture in the middle of an arid wasteland was an intentional act of power. It demonstrated that even the most barren, inhospitable lands could be tamed and transformed by the will of the caliph. These castles sent a message that Umayyad authority extended beyond cities and farms into the very heart of nature's emptiness. Remote placement also ensured secrecy and exclusivity. These castles were where sensitive negotiations could unfold, where tribal leaders could be wooed with gifts and luxury, far from the rumors and rivalries of urban politics. The solitude created space for diplomacy, indulgence, and experimentation, whether that meant engaging with foreign customs or enjoying figural art forbidden in stricter religious settings. Additionally, the locations were often more strategic than they appeared. Some castles sat near seasonal trade routes or vital water sources. Others acted as administrative checkpoints, keeping tabs on Bedouin tribes or serving as resting points for messengers and caravans. Their locations may have looked remote on a map, but in the political topography of the early Islamic Empire, they were well-placed chess pieces. And finally, there's the aesthetic. The vast emptiness of the desert served as a backdrop that amplified the majesty of the structures themselves. The contrast between barren land and intricate stonework made these castles feel like miracles, man-made oases of culture and elegance, standing in proud defiance of nature. Their remoteness wasn't a flaw, it was the point. Each desert castle was a quiet roar, declaring that refinement, rule, and beauty could bloom even where nothing else dared to grow. The desert castles of Jordan may no longer echo with the footsteps of caliphs, diplomats, or stargazers, but they endure quiet relics of an empire that dared to inscribe its grandeur into emptiness. And today they serve a different purpose. They are windows into a vanished world, drawing in scholars, tourists, and dreamers who walk their sand-swept halls in search of forgotten stories. Modern Jordan has embraced these sites not only as historical treasures, but as symbols of cultural resilience. Castles like Qusr Amra, Qasr el Karana, and Qasr el Mashada are now protected heritage sites, with Qusr Amra proudly wearing its UNESCO World Heritage Site status. Restoration projects, carefully balancing preservation with authenticity, have stabilized frescoes, cleared debris, and opened these ruins to public exploration. Still, time and nature remain persistent adversaries. The harsh desert climate, intense sun, dry winds, and sand erosion continue to threaten the delicate artwork and structures. Conservationists face the daunting task of protecting sites that were never meant to last over 1,000 years, let alone face modern tourism and climate challenges. But the effort persists, driven by a sense that these ruins hold not just artistic or architectural value, but spiritual and cultural insight for modern visitors. These castles provoke wonder and questions. How could such beauty exist in such isolation? What does it say about the nature of power, art, and survival? Walking through Qusr Amra's painted chambers, or gazing through the narrow windows of Qasr al-Harana, one is struck not by decay, but by the persistence of memory, and in a broader sense, the desert castles remind us that the early Islamic world was far more diverse, creative, and open than often portrayed. These structures challenge assumptions about art in Islam, about luxury in the desert, about the boundaries between East and West. They reveal a dynasty that was at once rooted in tradition and hungry for innovation today. The castles stand alone again, surrounded by silence and stone, but they are no longer forgotten. They speak not with shouts, but with whispers about a civilization that saw the desert not as a void, but as a stage. And against all odds, their story still travels across the sands, echoing into the modern world. Imagine a world without numbers, without writing, without even the concept of months or hours. This was the world of our Paleolithic ancestors. Yet even then, time moved and people noticed. Before there were calendars, timekeeping devices, or even language to describe it, early humans tracked time by watching nature. The rhythm of the earth, its light, its seasons, its sky was their only clock. The most obvious cycle was the day itself. Sunrise and sunset divided time into light and dark. But beyond that, humans quickly learned to observe the moon. Its phases were consistent and dramatic, a glowing disk growing, shrinking, and disappearing with eerie regularity. The moon became the first timekeeper, dividing life into repeating units that would later inspire the idea of month, in fact. The word month itself comes from the moon to early humans. A full lunar cycle, about 29.5 days, meant far more than a pretty light in the night sky. It was a guide for hunting, planting, gathering, and preparing for what came next. But the moon wasn't alone. Shadows changed length throughout the year. The position of the sun at sunrise shifted along the horizon, and certain stars only appeared during specific seasons. Over generations, communities began to notice these patterns and, more importantly, to pass them on. This knowledge wasn't just observational, it was sacred. Understanding time meant understanding the gods, the land, and life itself. Ancient people carved notches into bones, painted symbols on cave walls, and aligned stones with the sun's rising point during solstices. These weren't primitive scribbles. They were early efforts at marking the passage of time. Some of the oldest known calendars come from 30,000 years ago. Antler bones with carved tally marks, possibly tracking moon cycles or menstrual cycles, both deeply tied to survival and fertility. In the absence of clocks, early humans lived in tune with nature's cues. Time was not abstract. It was the breath of the earth. It told you when to move, when to hunt, when to hide, and when to hope. Before time had numbers, it had meaning, and before it had names, it had stories etched in stone, passed by firelight and guided by the heavens above. For ancient humans, the moon wasn't just a source of light, it was a clock written in the sky. Its phases were predictable and mesmerizing, waxing crescent to full moon, then waning to darkness before the cycle began again. This roughly 29.5 day rhythm was the earliest and most universally observed natural cycle. Long before civilizations rose, hunter-gatherers across continents were counting moons, not years or weeks, but moons. These lunar phases became the foundation of the first real calendars. We know this because archaeologists have found engraved bones and stones with carved markings in repeating sequences, likely tallying the days between each visible moon phase. Some of these artifacts are over 30,000 years old, predating writing and even agriculture. One such find, the Ishengo bone from Central Africa, contains a series of notches that many scholars believe correspond to a lunar calendar. Perhaps even one used to track fertility or hunting seasons. Why the moon? Because it was the easiest way to see time change. Solar changes happen slowly, and stars require deep knowledge. But the moon was obvious, shifting every few days and offering a sense of progress. For early humans, especially nomadic ones, this was practical and reliable. A month was a complete moon cycle, and 12 of those came close to a full solar year, though not quite. This mismatch would cause problems later, especially for agricultural societies that needed more accurate planting schedules. As civilizations began to form, many cultures formalized these lunar calendars. The Babylonians, Egyptians, Chinese, Maya, and Hebrews all used versions of lunar timekeeping. Some, like the Islamic calendar, remain strictly lunar to this day. Others began adjusting, adding leap days or months to sync the moon's cycle with the solar year. But in these early stages, the moon reigned supreme. The calendar wasn't just a tool, it was a sacred map. The moon was often personified as gods, goddesses, or celestial beings who watched over the people. Its cycles were tied to festivals, rituals, and myths in tracking the moon. Early humans weren't just measuring time, they were giving it meaning. The moon taught us to count, and in counting we began to understand time not as an endless blur, but as something that could be held, named, and passed on. As human societies evolved from nomadic bands to settled agricultural communities, the moon alone was no longer enough. Farming required more than knowing when a month had passed. It demanded precise awareness of the seasons, when to plant, when to harvest, when rains would come or frost would return. And for that, early humans turned to the sun. Unlike the moon, the sun's movement were subtle, stretching across the horizon over the course of a year. But those who observed patiently began to notice a pattern. The sun did not rise and set in the same place every day. At certain times of year, what we now call the solstices and equinoxes, the sun reached key turning points. These became cosmic anchors, marking the longest and shortest days, and the times when day and night balanced perfectly. Ancient people began to build solar calendars, not with ink, but with stone. The most famous example is Stonehenge in England. Though its exact purpose remains debated, its alignment with the summer and winter solstices is unmistakable. On those days, the sun rises or sets perfectly in line with specific stones. In a world without clocks, this was breathtaking precision. Similar alignments appear across the globe in the Nabta Playa stone circle in Egypt's desert, in Chaco Canyon in North America, and in the temples of Machu Picchu. These weren't random. They were built by sky watchers who connected celestial events with agricultural cycles and religious rituals. For these ancient societies, the sun was more than a giant torch. It was divine. Many cultures worshipped solar deities. Ra in Egypt, Inti in the Andes, Surya in India. The return of the sun after the longest night was often cause for celebration, symbolizing rebirth and continuity. These festivals, aligned with solar events, eventually formed the backbone of early religious calendars. Tracking the sun required patience, architecture, and spiritual vision. It meant observing not just 1 month at a time, but a full solar year, mapping the sky, recording the horizon, and marking time with permanence. Where the moon gave us motion, the sun gave us structure. Through stones and shadows, humans began to bind the heavens to the earth. And in doing so, time was no longer just a cycle. It became a calendar, carved into the land, aligned with the stars and wrapped in the sacred. For early civilizations, tracking time wasn't just about agriculture or seasons. It was a spiritual act. Time itself was sacred, a divine rhythm flowing from the heavens into daily life. Each moment had meaning. Each season carried cosmic weight. Calendars weren't simply charts. They were instruments of ritual designed to align human behavior with the will of the gods. In ancient Mesopotamia, priests climbed ziggurats not just to be closer to the sky, but to observe the stars and planets. These observations weren't purely scientific. They were acts of devotion. The Babylonians divided time with stunning accuracy. A 7-day week, a 360-day year, and even a base 60 number system that still influences how we measure minutes and degrees. But this wasn't about efficiency, it was about order. By measuring time, they were mirroring the divine structure of the universe. Egyptians took it even further. Their calendar, one of the most advanced in the ancient world, was tied closely to the Nile and the rising of Sirius, the brightest star in the sky. When Sirius reappeared at dawn, it signaled the flooding of the Nile, a life-giving event. That celestial moment marked the start of the Egyptian New Year, a celebration tied to fertility, rebirth, and the favor of the gods. Across the ocean, the Maya developed one of the most intricate calendar systems ever devised, combining lunar cycles, solar years, planetary motions, and sacred numbers into an interlocking series of time counts. Their Tzolk'in calendar tracked the 260-day spiritual cycle, while the Harb tracked the 365-day solar year. Time for the Maya was not linear. It was cyclical, divine, and deeply bound to prophecy and ritual. Every moment had a spirit. Every date had a destiny. Festivals, sacrifices, coronations, and even wars were timed to coincide with celestial rhythms. Kings were crowned not just when politically convenient, but when the stars aligned. To ignore the calendar was to invite chaos, not just in the fields, but in the cosmos. In this world, to keep time was to hold power not over people, but over meaning itself. Sacred time governed the lives of ancient civilizations, and through sun, moon, and star. The calendar became not just a record of passing days, but a bridge between the mortal and the divine. As civilizations grew more complex, so too did their need to organize time beyond months and seasons. The concept of a year, a full cycle of Earth's orbit around the sun, slowly took shape. But understanding that a year lasted about 365.25 days wasn't easy. It took centuries of observation, correction, and yes, frustration. The earliest formalized years were often imperfect. Lunar calendars, while useful, created a problem. 12 lunar months only added up to about 354 days, nearly 11 days short of the solar year. Over time, this gap caused chaos. Harvest festivals began to drift into the wrong season, and spring rituals occurred in the heart of winter. Civilizations had to make a choice: stay loyal to the moon or correct the drift. Many opted for the latter. The Babylonians created a lunar calendar, but added an intercalary month every few years to realign the calendar with the seasons. The Egyptians, however, took a bolder step. They abandoned the moon entirely and adopted a solar calendar, 365 days divided into 12 months of 30 days, with 5 extra days tacked on at the end. This was revolutionary and incredibly accurate for its time, but the Egyptian year still lagged behind the true solar year by 1/4 of a day. Over centuries, this caused a noticeable drift. New Year festivals fell later and later. Enter the Romans, who inherited both Egyptian and Greek timekeeping and attempted to clean it up. Their early Roman calendar was a confusing blend of lunar months and political manipulation. Months were added or removed based on political needs, causing enormous inconsistencies. It wasn't until Julius Caesar introduced the Julian calendar in 45 BCE that things changed. Advised by the Alexandrian astronomer Sosigenes, Caesar implemented a 365-day year with a leap day every 4 years, accounting for that pesky extra quarter day. It was a monumental fix and the first truly solar calendar. To gain widespread use across an empire, the idea of a year became not just a tool for farming, but for taxation, governance, military campaigns, and religious observances. The calendar now shaped empires. The invention of the year was humanity's triumph over chaos, a decision to place order on the swirling sky. And once we'd named a year, we began to measure everything within it, giving history its rhythm and civilization its pulse. With a year defined, humanity's next challenge was to break it down, to carve the vast stretch of days into manageable, meaningful chunks. This gave rise to months and weeks, two inventions that added rhythm to our timekeeping and stitched the fabric of daily life into something predictable and sacred. Months, at their root, come from the moon. Most ancient societies initially based their calendars on lunar cycles, a 29.5-day rhythm between full moons. 12 of these created a lunar year, totaling roughly 354 days. But since this didn't align with the 365-day solar year, societies began to manipulate the system, adding leap months, adjusting day counts, or switching entirely to solar-based months like the Egyptians and later the Romans. The Romans are largely responsible for the names and shapes of the months we use today. Their early calendars started in March, and months were named after gods like Martius for Mars, numbers September for 7, and later emperors July for Julius Caesar, August for Augustus. Through political reforms, most notably Caesar's Julian calendar, the 12-month solar calendar became standardized, with months ranging from 28 to 31 days. But what about the week? That strange 7-day unit that doesn't neatly divide a month or a year. Its origins are more mystical than astronomical. The Babylonians, fascinated with the number 7, derived it from the 7 visible celestial bodies: the Sun, Moon, Mars, Mercury, Jupiter, Venus, and Saturn. They assigned each day to a planet. a practice that influenced later Greek and Roman naming systems and survives today in many languages. The Jews solidified the 7-day week through religious tradition. In Genesis, God created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh. This sacred structure was adopted and carried through into Christianity and Islam, eventually spreading across the Western world. By the time the Romans adopted it in the 1st century CE, the 7-day week had become a fixture. Not because it was logical, but because it was meaningful. Unlike months and years, the week has no natural basis. It's a human invention, a rhythm imposed on time. Yet it endures, shaping work schedules, religious observance, and social life across centuries and civilizations. By breaking time into months and weeks, humanity gave time rhythm, and rhythm in turn gave us ritual rest and routine. As civilizations matured, calendars evolved from tools of survival into instruments of power. Whoever controlled the calendar controlled not just the seasons, but society itself. Taxes, festivals, harvests, royal decrees, and even war campaigns were governed by the date. Calendars became political tools, religious statements, and cultural weapons used to shape identity, unify empires, and reinforce authority. In ancient Rome, Julius Caesar's reform of the chaotic Roman calendar wasn't just a bureaucratic fix, it was a statement. The new Julian calendar, introduced in 45 BCE, imposed order over disorder. It allowed the Roman Empire to synchronize administration across vast territories, from Britain to Egypt, and with July renamed in Caesar's honor, the calendar itself became a monument to his legacy. Later, Augustus Caesar followed suit, naming August after himself and adjusting its length to equal July, because no emperor wanted his month to be shorter than his predecessors. In Rome, even time had to flatter power. Meanwhile, in China, imperial dynasties created calendars tailored to the reigning emperor's mandate. The Chinese calendar, the sophisticated lunisolar system, wasn't just practical. It was symbolic. When a new emperor rose, a new calendar cycle often began, reinforcing the idea that he had inherited the mandate of heaven. The calendar reflected cosmic harmony and the emperor's place within it. The Islamic calendar, established during the reign of Caliph Umar in the 7th century CE, began with a political and spiritual event, the Hijra, or Prophet Muhammad's migration from Mecca to Medina. Unlike solar calendars, it remained purely lunar, making religious festivals float through the seasons. That fluidity, however, became a unifying thread, tying Muslims across different regions and climates to the same spiritual timeline. Even in medieval Europe, calendars became battlegrounds for authority. The Church aligned saints' days and religious festivals with pre-existing pagan cycles to ease conversion. Time itself was baptized. The calendar didn't just tell people what day it was. It told them how to behave. Calendars weren't neutral. They were curated by those in charge, defining when debts were due, when armies marched, when gods were honored, and when history began. From emperors to priests, kings to astronomers, the right to mark time became a form of dominion, because to shape the calendar was to shape reality itself, to make your story the rhythm of everyone else's life. By the 16th century, time itself had drifted out of sync. The Julian calendar, once a masterpiece of Roman engineering, had slowly lost accuracy. It miscalculated the solar year by about 11 minutes annually, a small error that over centuries added up. By the 1500s, the spring equinox, which once fell around March 21st, had crept backward to March 10th. For a church that depended on precise dates to celebrate Easter, this was a theological crisis. Enter Pope Gregory XIII, who in 1582 launched the most significant calendar reform in history, the Gregorian calendar. Guided by Jesuit astronomers and mathematicians, the Pope's solution was both simple and radical. To realign the calendar with the actual solar year, 10 days were dropped. October 4, 1582 was immediately followed by October 15th. Time itself was rewritten, but the reform didn't stop there. Gregory's team also revised the leap year rule. The Julian calendar added a leap day every 4 years, but that was too generous. The new rule kept the leap year every 4 years, unless the year was divisible by 100, unless again it was divisible by 400. So 1600 was a leap year, but 1700, 1800, 1900 were not. This corrected the long-term drift and brought the calendar's accuracy within 26 seconds per year of the solar cycle. Still, adoption wasn't immediate or universal. Protestant and Orthodox nations viewed the Gregorian calendar with suspicion, seeing it as a Catholic power play. England didn't adopt it until 1752, by which point the error had grown to 11 days. Russia didn't switch until after the Bolshevik Revolution in 1918. The result? For centuries, dates could differ drastically between countries. Imagine two people celebrating New Year's 2 weeks apart in neighboring lands. Despite resistance, the Gregorian calendar eventually became the global standard, not because of religion, but because of practicality as science, navigation, commerce, and international diplomacy grew. The world needed a shared system of time. The Gregorian calendar was simply too precise, too useful to ignore. This wasn't just a correction. It was a revolution in how humanity experienced time. With the stroke of a papal pen, the world's days were recalibrated and modern timekeeping was born. In the end, the Gregorian reform did more than fix Easter. It aligned the human clock with the celestial one, once again making time a dance between heaven and earth. Today, the calendar feels ordinary, something printed on smartphones, office walls, and kitchen magnets. But behind its grids and numbers lies a legacy thousands of years in the making, a journey from sacred ritual to mechanical precision, from observing the stars to syncing with satellites. Timekeeping, once the domain of priests and astronomers, is now a global system standardized. Regulated and relentlessly ticking, we now use the Gregorian calendar almost universally. It governs everything from international law to shipping schedules, space missions, and the Olympic Games. But while this calendar dominates, others still exist, echoing ancient rhythms. The Islamic Hijri calendar continues to guide religious life for millions of Muslims. The Hebrew calendar governs Jewish holidays and traditions. The Chinese lunar calendar shapes festivals like the Lunar New Year. In India, regional calendars coexist alongside the Gregorian one. Humanity didn't abandon its diversity. It simply added layers of utility on top of ancient roots. And then there's atomic time, the most precise method of timekeeping ever created based on the vibrations of cesium atoms, International Atomic Time. Time measures seconds with such accuracy that it would only gain or lose 1 second every hundreds of millions of years. From this, we derive coordinated universal time, the global time standard used for everything from internet protocols to airline schedules. Leap seconds are sometimes added to UTC to account for Earth's slightly inconsistent rotation, a reminder that even in the age of perfection, the planet itself refuses to be completely predictable. Yet despite all this precision, we still live according to rhythms that are deeply human. We celebrate birthdays. We look forward to the weekend. We count down to midnight on New Year's Eve, hearts full of hope, just as ancient people once watched the horizon for the return of the sun. The calendar, in its modern form, is both a tool and a tradition. It keeps airplanes from colliding, yes, but it also reminds us when to gather, when to rest, and when to remember. Behind its cold efficiency lies the same desire that drove our ancestors to carve notches into bones and align stones with the sky, the yearning to understand our place in time. In measuring time, we measure ourselves past, present, and the dreams that await tomorrow.